This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
4 minutes after 10 is the time, and there's part of me that thinks, why on earth do we pay so much attention to the burblings of a man of mediocre intelligence, albeit a very expensive education, who, to his credit, like his father, despite their intellectual shortcomings, takes a great interest in the world around them, partly because they actually rule a country, albeit not with medieval levels of power. The very notion of kingship some days seems absolutely absurd, doesn't it? The very notion of monarchy seems absolutely bonkers. In other royal news, the future Queen of Belgium is going out with a lad from Rochdale, according to some newspapers, which, again, are human beings, eh? What a weird old species we are. But it is significant when they do stuff, or at least it's newsworthy. There's an interesting PhD, eh? What's the difference between significant and newsworthy? Oh, I don't know, but I do know this, and I think we should all be grateful to Lucy in Bushy this morning, not only the first entry into Idiot's Corner, but a beautiful illustration of something that you may not even have noticed yourself. So Lucy's been in touch already to say, oh, here we go, you're off again. The question is about the Prince of Wales, although to, I suppose, the amusement of everybody involved, you've managed to insert an unnecessary H into the word Wales there, which is certainly distracting. Speaking out, but you spin it your way. Well, the point is that nobody seemed to notice the unprecedented public statement from the Prince and Princess of Wales at the beginning of October. And the use of the word unprecedented here is not my own. It comes from the Jewish News. And it was with reference to the condemnation of Hamas. So I'm looking at the inbox that I've inherited from Nick, who I'm sure mentioned this, the fact that it's not unprecedented at all and that the Prince of Wales had issued an unequivocal condemnation of Hamas. But I'm looking at the inbox I've inherited, and it's full of people saying, why hasn't he condemned Hamas? Why hasn't he called for the hostages to be released? And then you've got people like Lucy and Bushy thinking that this intervention is unprecedented and that because he's essentially called upon Israel to stop killing Palestinians, something extraordinary has happened, something both significant and newsworthy. And yet this, described by the Jewish News as unprecedented public statement from the Prince and Princess of Wales, who, quotes, hold all the victims, their families and their friends in their hearts and minds, while utterly condemning, quotes again, the Hamas attacks on Israel, for the avoidance of any doubt whatsoever, quite correct, quite and completely correctly, nobody noticed. Certainly didn't make the front page of the Daily Mail. What would they have said? Prince risks controversy? I don't know. It just wouldn't be controversial at all. Please don't kill people. If you are killing people, you're disgusting. He doesn't go that far. In fact, he doesn't really go very far at all. So we're left with the question, perhaps, as to why some people, and oddly, they are people who routinely use the word snowflake as a pejorative, have got their knickers in such a twist about Prince William essentially saying, hey, too many people have died, guys. Why can't we all just get along? It's the most vanilla of interventions, and yet it is something that is apparently controversial. The Prince and Princess of Wales are profoundly distressed by the devastating events that have unfolded in the past days. The horrors inflicted by Hamas's terrorist attack upon Israel are appalling. They went further. They said that as Israel exercises its right of self-defense, all Israelis and Palestinians will continue to be stalked by grief, fear and anger in the time to come. They added that they hold all the victims, their families and their friends in their hearts and minds, and spoke of the necessity of Israel defending itself. Now, there's something quite strange happening there, isn't there? I don't know what you or who you've been relying on for your coverage of Prince William's intervention, but if it's the Daily Mail, you'd think this was the first time in history that anybody from the royal family had said anything at all about the situation in the Middle East, let alone the last 5 months, let alone the last 16, 17 weeks. But there it is, described as unprecedented by the Jewish News. And yet I turn to the front of the Daily Mail today and it says Prince risks controversy with impassioned and unprecedented intervention and says, like others, I want an end to the fighting. So anyone calling it unprecedented is lying to you. I think it perhaps was unprecedented on October the 10th when he actually weighed in behind Israel's right to respond robustly to that terror attack on October the 7th. But to say now, can it stop, please? There is a desperate need. Let's run through it, shall we? You can tell how bad things are because the Daily Mail have had to do one of those things where they run lines on what he actually said, and then they put another paragraph underneath it on what they say what it means. Can you imagine what that's like? So here's what he said. Oh, and here's what it means. It means that if your nan still reads the Daily Mail, she's not reading what Prince William said. She's reading what the editor of the Daily Mail wants you to think that Prince William said. What he said, what it means. It happened to me once, although only online. One of my first ill-advised forays into conversation about trans people and about gender-neutral changing rooms. I had no idea how hot that topic was. We're going back a few years now. Then about 6 months later, I found this thing online where someone had rung in and done an entire transcript of the conversation using red ink to tell me what I'd really meant. So I would have said, good morning, and then in red ink it'd say, what he really means is, go to hell, you monstrous human. And then I would say, what would you like to talk about today? And then in red ink, what he really means, I hate you and everything you stand for, and all women are awful. I mean, it was just insane, but an early indicator, a canary down the coal mine, perhaps, of where the so-called debate about transgender people and their human rights would go in the months to follow. But they've done it to Prince William today. I remain deeply concerned about the terrible human cost of the conflict in the Middle East since the Hamas terrorist attack on October the 7th. Too many have been killed. What is wrong with that? Where does that go in any sense that could be described as controversial? Well, I'll tell you. It is controversial in the same way that the condemnation of the Hamas terrorist attack last year was controversial, because it means he is offering an opinion. Full stop. He is offering an opinion. And the opinion, I think, can be loosely construed as not subscribing to the notion that Benjamin Netanyahu's government should be able to do whatever they want in Gaza, up to and including, according to one member of his own cabinet, dropping a nuclear bomb on the territory. So what Prince William has highlighted, I think, today is the difficulty of saying anything at all in the crucible of right-wing American and British media, largely driven by Rupert Murdoch, with the Daily Mail and Andrew Neil's ridiculous Spectator lobbling along not far behind. Saying anything remotely critical of Israel will get you a kicking. So what the Mail does now is desperately try to recast these words, which are saying essentially, please stop killing people, and obviously Hamas are disgusting too, as being less than a call for a cessation of hostilities. So he says, I, like so many others, want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. What do you think that means? Can you think of a single word that describes an end to the fighting? I mean, is there a word? I'll give you a clue. It rhymes with lease pyre. Can you think of a word that rhymes with lease pyre and would essentially describe an end to the fighting as soon as possible? No? All right, I'll carry on. He also says there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. It's critical that aid gets in and that hostages are released. So I'm still reading text saying, why doesn't he call for the hostages to be released? I'm not telling you what he means. I'm just asking you if you can think of another word to describe calling for an end to the fighting as soon as possible and suggesting that it might rhyme with peace liar or lease pyre. I don't know. But the Mail are telling you that he pointedly stops short of calling for the immediate ceasefire demanded by the left, which critics warn could allow Hamas to rearm. In a balanced statement, he underlines the desperate need to relieve human suffering in Gaza, while also calling on Hamas to release the remaining hostages. Look at the size of that knot that you've tied yourself into. So he is actually calling for an immediate end to the fighting, but he's definitely not calling for a ceasefire, because that's what the left is doing. I hate to break it to you, lads, but he categorically is calling for a ceasefire, albeit with the obvious addition that Hamas should release the hostages as well. The difference, as ever, since the beginning of this nightmare, the difference is that if you accept the portrayal as Hamas as a death cult or a terrorist group, then you cannot expect them or demand somehow that they behave in a rational and law-abiding fashion. You categorically can demand the same of an ally like Israel. And he is. It's extraordinary, really, isn't it, that you would need to, when this statement would have been picked over, carefully contemplated, it would have gone across various desks before it found its way into the public space. But the Daily Mail still takes it upon itself to tell its readers what they think Prince William must really mean, because his words are not clear enough. Incredible, really. I want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. How much wiggle room is there, do you think? How big is the grey area? I want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. So the point I'm making in my characteristically clumsy fashion is this, all right? The controversy here is not about Prince William offering up an opinion, because he offered up an unprecedented, not my words, the Jewish News, he offered up an unprecedented and a powerful condemnation of Hamas after the October the 7th terror attack. So there is nothing unprecedented about calling for a ceasefire. So what's happened today across much of the British media is that people have got their knickers in a twist about Prince William apparently allying himself with the idea that Israel should not be allowed to continue to do whatever it wants in the Gaza Strip, up to and obviously including a ground offensive on Rafah, which pretty much the entire world is now united against. Even as America vetoes a call for a ceasefire from the United Nations, they effectively call upon explicitly call upon Benjamin Netanyahu not to start a ground offensive against Rafah. We spoke to a young woman yesterday, a 21-year-old Irish-Palestinian woman who gave us a tiny idea, the tiniest inkling of what it must be like to have already moved 4, 5, 6 times and now being told that your final place of sanctuary is about to get blasted too. So that's what he's done. That's why he's upset some of the usual suspects. He has offered an opinion that is not aligned with theirs. It is instead aligned with the immeasurable majority of the British people, only 13% of whom, I think, support the idea of further offensives in Gaza by Israel. Some polling that, again, probably has been absented from much of the coverage of Prince William's intervention. And I still have in the back of my mind that sense of how ridiculous all this is. I mean, why would the intervention of a very well-educated, but by his own admission, not super bright human being, have such weight, carry such force in the context of something as complicated and as bloody as the continuing carnage in Gaza? It is mad, but that's the country that we live in. You, and I hate to think that this is news to you, but you are his future subject, all being well. You will be his subject one day, a subject of his monarchical rule. So to suggest that we shouldn't pay any attention to what he has to say about anything is seductive but ridiculous. You kind of have to. And it does change things. It does put into perspective the, shall we say, the lack of nuance or the rather monopolistic coverage of the conflict that you have received or that we read everywhere. Because if 13% of the population are against it and 80% of the print media are essentially cool with it, someone's got to step into that space, wave a little flag of truth. The question I've got for you today is whether or not it should be Prince William. So I'm going to be hugely ambitious on this. I'm going to try to conduct this conversation independently of what you think about the conflict in Gaza. I am almost certainly going to fail, but there is no point in not aiming high. As the great Samuel Beckett once wrote, fail, fail again, fail better. So today we will fail. Tomorrow we will fail again. And on Friday, we will fail better. I've probably misremembered that quote, but in a sense, that would be quite opposite, wouldn't it? So here's the point. What I'd love to know is whether you think Prince William should be wading in at all, whether or not you prefer his grandmother's approach to monarchy and that you wouldn't even know what her favourite colour was or her favourite flower. You knew nothing about them. They often said, never let the light in. Prince Charles is King Charles, no less, is a very different creature. He proved to be quite prescient on matters environmental and even architectural, when much of the country was being encouraged by precisely the same people telling you what Prince William really meant when he called for a ceasefire in Gaza. We're encouraging you to laugh at him and tease him about talking to trees and the rest of it. It turns out he was way ahead of the curve. So there's a strong case there for interventions from members of the royal family. I don't know that we're qualified today to have a conversation about whether it changes anything, because that would just divide us along the lines of people who think it's hugely important whenever he breaks wind, and people that frankly couldn't give a fig one way or the other. So I'm going to try, and I am going to fail, but I am going to try to conduct this conversation from the perspective of his opinions not mattering, but his right to express them being questionable. So, what do you think? I like it. I'm not going to lie to you. I like it. I like the idea of somebody with the benefit of having very little skin in any game, albeit that they're still terrified of being attacked by the right wing. I wouldn't be surprised if Nigel Farage has had a swing at him already, while presumably staying relatively silent about the murder of Alexei Navalny by the monster that he, Nigel Farage, considers to be the most admirable politician in the world. So you will paint a target on your back if you're King Charles or Prince William in this kind of context. But what's the point of having them? I like the last Queen. I think she was very much the right monarch for our ages. But what's the point of having one of the most famous public figures on the planet if they're not allowed ever to tell you what they think about something? So thank God he condemned the Hamas attack on October the 7th, and thank God today he's calling for a ceasefire, even though the Daily Mail are desperate to pretend that he isn't. 0345 6060 973. And if you just want a quick indicator of how boiled the brains of a lot of the people leading these conversations actually are, imagine for a moment what would be before you today on your television screens, coming out of your radio speakers, in your morning newspaper, if Prince Harry had expressed the desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. If Prince Harry had said that I, like so many others, want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. So he might not like it, but thank God Prince William is finally beginning to behave a bit like his brother.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 24 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We're going to try and fail to have a conversation about Prince William offering strong views on the need for a ceasefire in Gaza, while acknowledging that it will be almost impossible to do that without somehow allowing your own views on the need for a ceasefire in Gaza to creep into the conversation. But we will look also at the broader question of whether or not it's absolutely ridiculous to expect someone who's going to be king one day to have no public opinions at all. Seems to me to be absurd. Although, as I said, it will involve painting targets on his back. And like night follows day, I was right. Nigel Farage, one of my colleagues, actually, Lewis Goodall, has just sent me a tweet. That Nigel Farage has indeed attacked the future king for offering an opinion on the ceasefire in Israel. History does not relate whether he's yet offered an opinion on Vladimir Putin, the politician that he, Nigel Farage, admires most in the world, murdering Alexei Navalny. But hey-ho. Prince William's fair game for the Farage. Vladimir Putin, the most admirable politician in the world. And, of course, no one can ever question his patriotism. 10:25 is the time. Matthew's in Addleston. Matthew, what do you reckon?
Second-time caller. Thank you very much for having me on. Nigel Farage probably should go back to his garage, I imagine.
Well done.
And of course, yesterday, wonderful show yesterday, and your female producer was as good as any, man. She was very, very thorough with me. My opinion, James, is that I was thinking back. I'm not a royalist, but I watched all of The Crown, and the Queen very much did keep her own counsel, but we kind of did know, who her favourite son was, what football team she supported.
Well, only because you watched The Crown, mate, which is not a documentary. You didn't know who her favourite...
No, 100%, James. My point... Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to get my point out here.
Well, take your time, but just focus on what you rang in for and forget about all the extra trimmings. Yes.
Yeah, so the point that I phoned in for, James, is that I believe that this is what he truly believes. I think that this he's taking.
But what if he believed the opposite? What if he'd come out and said, and I think this is highly unlikely, but if he came out and said I think Israel should raise Gaza to the ground? What if he sounded like a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet, or one of the members of his cabinet that attended the settler conference a couple of weeks ago?
Then he should probably, and as you say, as our monarch, you're playing devil's advocate for both sides really well. And I'm not.
I'm completely on his side. I think he's got every right to wade in. But I'm conscious of my own bias. I want a ceasefire. Some people don't, and the people that don't are going to have a problem with what he's said. So you can't say it's good that he's waded in if you don't also think it would be good of him to wade in support of the idea of dropping a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip. Now I'm being the devil's advocate.
Thank you, James, and I agree. I think that's the problem of the devil's in the detail of the royal family, which is that they are supposed to be impartial.
And there it is. He is supposed to be impartial. I needed Matthew there like a whetstone to sharpen my blade. I love what he's done, but I'm biased because I want the killing to stop too. And there are plenty of people that don't. We discovered that in our earliest phone-ins about this horrible story, when you'd say to people how much is too much, and they couldn't tell you. Not 10,000, not 20,000, not 30,000, not 500,000, not 1 million. We've got to carry on killing them until Hamas are eradicated or the hostages are released, one or the other, or possibly some people still clinging to the idea that both are possible. And that's the elephant in the room. There's a clip actually of an American politician kind of saying it out loud overnight. There's a splendid Twitter account called the Tennessee Holler, which I follow very interestingly for American political stuff. And I'll play that to you shortly as well. But on what possible grounds can you support Prince William coming out saying something that you like without also supporting his right to come out and say something that you don't? Samantha is in East Grinstead. Samantha, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, and thank you for having me on. I just want to say that I absolutely love your shows, and I'm not going to be biased because me and my lot, we love and adore you so much. But moving on, in regards to Prince William, I actually said this morning to my husband. I'd said, what if Prince Harry had done this?
Yes.
And also...
It's not quite the same, because Prince Harry, sadly, is not the future monarch.
and also... wasn't it Prince Harry who had taken those very companies or, media outlets to court and had won? He had essentially won, these trials against them. So it's very, very ironic is now that his brother is speaking up, and his brother now might be getting a taste of his own medicine because, he was told be wary of these outlets and so forth and the other by his own brother, Prince Harry. The documentary.
No, he sided with the newspapers against his brother. I think that's a matter of record, but out of an impulse for self-protection that is pretty hard to argue with. So that's really interesting. The Mail, it's not the force it was, and we probably talk about it too much on this programme, but that's why they have to put words into his mouth, because they can't attack what he's said, so they have to tell their readers that he hasn't actually said what he said. He said something else.
Right, and James, I actually saw something horrific yesterday, as I've been seeing for months on end. Like the rest of us, you had said so brilliantly, some don't care, and there's others that do care. Now, this is just a human perspective. The bodies, the doctors crying, on these videos. They've got no electricity. Kids, they're breathing without any equipment. It's so disgusting. You've got snipers sniping young infants.
I don't know about that. You have to be you have to be slightly careful saying stuff on the radio that I haven't got in front of me. I think sniper, and someone now will no doubt send me horrific footage, but it needs to have been fact checked. What you can say with absolute certainty is that it is no coincidence that the Israeli government works so hard to keep journalists out of the Gaza Strip and to keep the images of what has been done there out of the eyes of the British public. You could not, I don't believe, sustain support for example, a ground offensive upon Rafah if you had a live link to cameras on every street corner in Rafah. You simply couldn't. But I do need to be careful, Samantha. You must understand that. 10:31 is the time. So in your own words, what has Prince William done wrong? 0345 6060 973. Or, if you prefer, have a crack from a constitutional point of view. So, independently of the current news, why is it important that members of the royal family don't offer opinions on any subject? 0345 6060 973. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:35 is the time. Shall we start a tradition, do you think, at the post 10:30 news, where I set up some things that I intend to tell you about a little later, and then completely forget about? We start a new tradition almost every day on this programme, and the only tradition is that we've forgotten about it by tomorrow. Actually, that's a real tradition. So we have got some actual traditions. Well, we've got one actual tradition on this programme, is that I constantly announce, and I've been doing this forever, I constantly announce a new tradition. We must start doing this more, and then I completely forget about it. But there is a river in the news today. It's an English river, and it has been adjudged to be one of the most poisoned rivers in the world. Which one do you think it is? The Thames, the Mersey, or the Severn? If you are, if you're like a mind reader, if you're, what's that lovely bloke called? Darren, what's his name? He's been on Full Disclosure. With the Darren Brown. Yeah, sorry, Darren. Could you tell them which one was the answer just from my voice? That's sometimes how it works, if I understand it. So the headline is, blank is one of the world's most poisoned rivers. Is it A, the River Mersey, B, the River Thames, or C, the River Severn? Would he know already which one it was from the way that I said the word? I don't know, actually. He might do. I'll reveal that, or not, as the case may be. Depends whether we observe the tradition or not, because that's the other tradition. Not just that I announce new traditions and then forget all about them, but also that I give you the first bit of a story, and as a way of cynically making sure that you keep me tuned to LBC, I promise to give you the second bit of the story a little bit later. Do you know, I get texts, or rather tweets. I get tweets at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon going, "What was the river? What was the river?" And oh, sorry, lads. I replied to them, actually, because I think that's a dereliction of duty on my part. So we'll have a look at that. And there's also a survey out today, which could have been designed for lazy radio phone-in hosts. It's a survey on what are our favourite sweets. We are definitely not doing a phone-in on this, but it is possibly something that I'll refer to a little later in the programme. I'm unsurprised by the first place, but absolutely scunnered by the fourth place sweet on this one, and there are some grave absences as well, in my humble opinion. But back to William and his intervention. Does it actually speak to something a little bit more than the current crisis in Gaza? In fact, as No Hostages points out on Twitter, there's a case for arguing that it is his job to uphold whatever British values actually are. And on this occasion, it sees in his words, it sees the royal family live as a symbol of a nation. So they should be obliged to avoid party politics. However, they are obliged to represent the UK's values on the international stage. And these are the words of No Hostages, not me. Oh, no, actually, I also agree with the use of the phrase ethnic cleansing. He says, in cases of ethnic cleansing, potential genocides or other violations of human rights and the rules of war, one can argue that they are obliged to diplomatically address such issues, provided you accept that such things are contrary to the UK's values. So if you think that ethnic cleansing and a potential genocide or other violations of human rights, such as collective punishment or the failure to ensure the delivery of aid, humanitarian aid, if you think that they are contrary to the UK's values and the UK government is not speaking up against them is not an act of party politics, it's an act of patriotism. And if you can't rely upon the future king to speak up for British values, which of course involves getting attacked by Nigel Farage, I mean, that's like night following day. Here is someone truly speaking up for British values from a position of sincerity and integrity. Here is Vladimir Putin's fanboy having a swing at them. Then who can? Matthew's in Bedford. Matthew, I think I failed to remain impartial on this question. Matthew, how are you getting on?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, so just speaking to your producer, the point I was trying to get across is that...
Well, I hope you got it across, because they've put you through and there's 10 other people waiting to come on the show.
I know, yeah, I was worried I was going to struggle to articulate myself.
Don't worry,
here,
take your time. Take your time,
Okay.
There's no rush.
I think, if he'd have taken a side in this, if he'd have said anything that was slightly controversial, showing support for either side, that wouldn't be what he's there to do. But he is merely asking for peace. He's asking for, he's saying that too many people have been killed and there should be a ceasefire. I just can't understand how it could be perceived as being any way controversial. And as you were just talking about the British values of,
well, I
compassion,
can, I'm afraid.
peace.
And I think this is the elephant in the room, actually, for some right-wing blowhards, is that they actually do. They can't quite say it out loud, although there's an American congressman who did, that they actually do believe, as Benjamin Netanyahu believes, in my opinion, that they can kill 1 million Palestinians. They can kill all of them while claiming that they're pursuing Hamas and pursuing the release of the hostages. That's why it's controversial, because it challenges that position. And you're right, it shouldn't be controversial. But I can't see any other explanation of why it would be. Not least because you're a bit wrong, because back at the beginning of October, him and his wife issued a statement roundly condemning Hamas and justifying Israel's right to respond. So in a sense, they did pick a side, but that's Hamas versus Israel. That's not the Gaza Strip, or rather Israel versus the Palestinian people. And you're right, he hasn't picked a side on that one. But that's why it's controversial, mate, I think, because either you stay silent or you give tacit support to the idea that Israel can kill as many Palestinians as they say they need to.
I think, like I say, I think he can potentially see where this is going, and he almost wants to bring this back to a neutral position to be, for, as you said previously, British values. That it's,
if there is a genocide underway, which of course the United Nations Supreme Court has deemed possible or plausible, if there is an ethnic cleansing underway, which I think is fairly probable under most understandings of that word, certainly a humanitarian crisis unfolding that will get worse if there is a ground offensive in Rafah, certainly questions very grave accusations of war crimes being committed in the arenas of both collective punishment and the failure to secure or the failure to ensure the passage of aid into the territory. All of those things, whoever is doing them, we should all be against, but we're not. Should Prince William therefore stay silent? I don't think so. I really don't think so. And the only bit where you're wrong is in that, which no one really seems to have noticed, that unprecedented public statement from the Prince and Princess of Wales on October the 10th, I think, October the 11th, holding all the victims, their families and their friends in their hearts and minds, while completely condemning Hamas for the horrors inflicted upon Israel. So if that was unprecedented, then why is yesterday's intervention? Thank you, mate. Chris is in Cleethorpes. Chris, what would you like to say?
Yes, good morning, James. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to say, certainly in my opinion, obviously he's got every right to express a personal opinion. He's not the head of state at the moment. He's a private citizen, albeit part of the nobility. Obviously, as you mentioned earlier, his father was never shy in expressing an opinion.
What if it was an opinion you hated?
Well, Philip, bless him, managed to trot out any number of things that I didn't.
Well, they were more gaffes, weren't they? They were more gaffes than diplomatic interventions. At the time he arrived in Australia, and they asked him if he had a criminal record, and he said, "I had no idea it was still necessary."
Yeah, to be honest, I think in a lot of those cases he knew exactly what he was doing, to be honest. Sure. I don't think they were gaffes particularly. But, the point is, I didn't agree with some of the things he said. But that's not the same as pretending he doesn't have a right to say them, which is an entirely different thing. I think with William, he'll probably do what he generally does and follow his dad's lead. Charles was always very clear that at the point he became king, he'd follow his mother's lead and stop expressing his personal opinions quite so much. So I don't think it's outrageous to think that his son, on taking up the role of the Prince of Wales, would kind of take over that role. And to be honest, in many ways, that's perhaps the only real legitimate purpose to that role at all.
Do you know the problem? Here's the problem. And I think it's an unavoidable one. And I think that you're right for the record. But every opinion you offer, unless it's completely vanilla, and this isn't far from being vanilla, but it's such a fraught territory and such a mad world we inhabit that it still is unprecedented and controversial, despite essentially saying, please stop killing people and why can't we all just get along? But every opinion you offer, as Farage proves, does actually involve putting a target on your back or losing the support of somebody. And that is an existential threat to the royal family. Now, the Queen could pull it off because of the era in which she ruled. And I think also because of the status that she enjoyed with every passing decade. She became almost immune to criticisms that would have applied to a much younger monarch or would apply to a monarch in a much different age. So every opinion they offer alienates somebody.
Well, I mean, the other thing with William in particular, James, I think, is if you bear in mind, I mean, he's realistically the most senior noble, so the most senior lord in the country, really.
God, the language is insane, isn't it? It sounds like something out of King Lear. I thought the king had more affected the Duke of Burgundy than Cornwall.
You know, whether you agree with the monarchy or not, I mean, the main legitimacy, potentially, to the House of Lords is that they can offer an opinion that isn't dependent on party politics, on needing to get elected. You know, I mean, and that's one of the benefits of having a
so they are immune from partisanship and party politics on some issues.
He can say what he likes. He can say what he believes. I mean, at the end of the day, that statement, as you said earlier, will have been through about, 10, 15 desks. It would have been looked at almost certainly by somebody from the Foreign Office. You know, I mean, they have whole teams of people at great expense checking this type of statement. It's not like this, as you said earlier with Philip, it's not like this was a completely unfiltered, off-the-cuff comment. I mean, this was a carefully considered diplomatic intervention, fully mindful of the potential criticism that it would bring from predictable quarters, which is where some people have suggested, myself included, that he is, in a sense, and he would hate this characterisation personally, he is stepping in his brother's footsteps. Although, of course, apart from the media attacks, his brother doesn't have the same constitutional responsibilities by dint of not being the heir to the throne. Caroline's been in touch. She says, I really think you should go to Israel and spend time with the IDF. You're so far away from the truth. I take your point, Caroline, but there are loads and loads and loads of reports, journalists who are approved by the IDF, given special vests to wear, can go where they want. I can read what they've written. I can see what Benjamin Netanyahu has said. I can see what his cabinet has said. I can read the speeches. I can see the settler conference. I can see the footage of IDF soldiers describing what they've done and why they're doing it. What I think we really need is actually an insight into what it's like on the other side of the border, where you'd have to ask the Israeli government why they wouldn't let me go there. It is 10:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, unaccompanied, of course. I'd want to send someone in, probably not me. I don't have the stones to be a foreign correspondent, but Matt Fry would be up for it, I'm fairly confident, and yet at the moment they're not really allowed to report from that part of the world. So you need to ask yourself, Caroline, why that is. The thing that you want me to do, loads of people are already doing. The thing that I would really like someone else to do, the Israeli government doesn't really permit. Now, let's just have a little think why that might be.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:52. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I am drawn this morning to the question. I mean, actually, I probably misspoke, didn't I, earlier? It hasn't failed miserably, although it is very difficult to separate your opinion about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza. And remember, only 13% of the UK population, according to the most recent polling, are in favour of further military action. So essentially, Prince William has just allied himself with the people outside of that 13% in calling for a ceasefire, albeit the Daily Mail tries desperately hard this morning to pretend that when saying that there is a need for people, for the killing to stop, or indeed when saying that he wants to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible, he's definitely not calling for a ceasefire. When is a ceasefire not a ceasefire? When Prince William calls for it and has the privilege of seeing the Daily Mail write a paragraph under the words he actually wrote that explains what he actually meant. That's through the lens, if you like, of what the Daily Mail wish he had said. So he's called for a ceasefire, but definitely hasn't called for a ceasefire. He's just called for an end to the fighting. Or if you like, a cease in the firing, a ceasing of firing, a cessation of firing. The firing will cease, but it's definitely not a ceasefire. And there we are. The question of why this is problematic, given that on October the 11th, Prince William and his wife issued a completely unequivocal condemnation of Hamas and indeed spoke of their support or stated their support for Israel's right to self-defense. So the simple conversation, and this is similar to what they're going to vote on in the House of Commons later, is where is the line between self-defense and whatever phrase you prefer at this point, collective punishment, unjustifiable attack, ethnic cleansing? Where is the line between self-defense and what's happening now? William seems to be of the view that it has been crossed, and he's obviously right. People who aren't prepared to say that they want more killing have got a problem with what he's done. I think it's that simple. I've got 5 minutes left. There's a couple of phone lines free. If I mean, hand on heart, this isn't disingenuous. If you think that's unfair or wrong, just politely, if you could, although rudely is fine too, tell me what I've missed. Who could possibly have a problem with Prince William calling for the killing to end, except people who don't want it to? 0345 6060 973. Owen's in Windsor. Owen, what would you like to say?
Hi. I'd like to say that I definitely think that Prince William should get involved in these matters. At the end of the day, he's not taking sides. He's taking the side of the slaughtered, the side of humanity, as he spoke against both the killing of civilians on both sides.
The killing of civilians in the other direction ended essentially on October the 7th. So I think if we you could construe it as taking a side, because only one side is currently killing civilians, really.
That's correct. So if anything, what he said in October was much more taking side than what he's saying now. But if we're talking about the actions now,
just to be clear, I'm sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you again. Just for my own benefit and clarity. Describing Israel's attack upon Gaza as self-defense was actually controversial at the time.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct. Israel as a state, as an occupying power, does not have a right to self-defense in the
well, no, that's not quite what I meant, and obviously you've now nailed your flags to the mast that makes it clear that you would welcome Prince William's intervention. How did you feel when he did speak up in defence of Israel's right to self-defence?
Now that is a different question, because when
I know.
When someone, one second.
You can have 10 seconds, but I'm going to insist that you answer it.
If someone does take the side of Israel, they're not standing with humanity.
Listen to yourself, man. You're saying it's great that he intervenes when I agree with what he's saying, but when I don't, it's awful.
No, it's not that I agree. Like you said, 13%, only 13% disagree.
Yes, but when he said, as Israel exercises its right of self-defense, he said that as well 4 months ago, and you don't think that Israel has a right of self-defense. So how do you feel about his right to make that statement?
Well, I must say that I disagree with that.
Yes, that's not what I asked. I said, how do you feel about his right to make that statement?
Well, he has the right to make the statement. Like I said, this is a question of humanity, and I believe that
the other statement, Owen,
yes.
the other statement. Should Prince William have the right to speak up in defence of Israel's right to, or in support of Israel's right of self-defence in the aftermath of a terror attack on Israeli soil, when that self-defence involves going into the occupied territory and killing people?
No. But that's not what he said.
It is.
He didn't say that Israel has a right to go and kill Palestinians. He said that Israel has a right to self-defense.
And he went on to say, all Israelis and Palestinians will continue to be stalked by grief, fear and anger in the time to come. I think we know what he was alluding to there, don't we?
I suppose. But with regards to the statement today,
yes.
I believe that he's standing with the people. And that is correct. The people have tried to convince governments to do the right thing. And I think also the only way for the people to make a difference is, in reality, to take a stance by using a boycott. Because it seems like nobody is listening. Governments are not listening. And what Prince William did, at least in this current statement, he's not only standing with humanity and the slaughtered, he's also standing with the people of the United Kingdom, which have clearly, as you said, only 13% seem to not support a ceasefire, whilst
No, 13% support. 13% support further military action. It's not the case that 87%. There'll be don't knows in there and the rest of it. But yes, thank you, Owen. I think we were 52%, 48% on that, trying to have a conversation. And Owen unintentionally proved the problem right at the end there, to separate your support for the Prince's right to speak out on controversial subjects, although I think there's a conversation to be had about why on earth calling for a ceasefire would be controversial. We didn't have that conversation today. Very difficult to separate your support for what he said from your support from the right to say it. So I don't know that we made an enormous amount of progress during that hour, but I enjoyed myself enormously, as indeed I hope you did, with the obvious caveat that behind the rhetoric and the semantics, we're discussing matters of life and genuine death, which will ramp up still further if Netanyahu sends troops into Rafah.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
This hour I will reveal which English river is now one of the world's most poisoned. I've given you some choices. Is it the Mersey, the Thames or the Severn? And if you enjoyed yesterday's story about the bike thieving gang being busted by the police deploying a tactic that I suggested about 8 years ago that they deploy, when someone first explained to me that a huge amount of bike thefts in London were undertaken by a relatively small number of operators. There's a great tale today about a global coalition of, I presume, hackers taking down the world's top cybercrime gang. I thought you might enjoy that. But we turn next. Oh, and we've got the sweets as well. I'll tell you what's at number 4 on the nation's favourite sweets. I bet you can't guess what's top. You'll just tell me what your favourite sweets are. Number 4 is quite controversial because it's cola bottles, right? Now, what do you see in your mind's eye when I say cola bottle? Well, let's find out. Ready? Don't close your eyes if you're driving. Otherwise, just take a moment out. If you're at work, make it look like you're thinking. Are you ready now? Are you ready? Okay. Cola bottle. What did you see? What did you see? Did it have fizzy sugar on the outside? Did it? Did it? Ah, you see. Yeah. Was it one of the giant Haribo ones that get stuck on your teeth because they haven't got gelatine in? Was it? Was it? Or was it one of the blue and pink ones, eh? The fizzy blue and pink ones that you get at the cinema? Was it one of them? So that's at least 3. No. Or was it the naked one? The normal cola bottle with no fizzy sugar on the outside? That's what I see. I see the naked one. The naked cola bottle. And that is why I don't understand how it can be at number 4 in the nation's favourite sweets. Because does that include all 4 variations on the cola bottle? And there's probably more. So what did you see when you closed your eyes and thought of the words cola bottle? What did you see? The blue and pink fizzy one? The normal fizzy one, the naked normal one, or the giant Haribo one? So that's why I'm not sure about this chart. I will share further details of it with you later, but I'll tell you something else that I'm just hang on a minute there. Just wait a goddamn minute. It's not got any of the new generation of Vimto sweets on it. Have you had any of the new generation of Vimto sweets? Vimto have done some serious branding lately. You get fizzy Vimto laces, you get Vimto flying saucers, Vimto chews, Vimto, all sorts of Vimto sweets, every single one of which is delicious. Not a single one of which has made this poll of the nation's top confectionery, which makes me somewhat suspicious. I'm very lucky. I can afford to buy all the sweets I want, which leads me incredibly clumsily into the next conversation that we're going to have. This might be one of the hardest subjects for a phone-in ever. And oddly, it sits alongside another story that I was drawn to, but which I'm not currently going to do this hour because I don't think I possess the radio creativity to knit these two stories together in a way that would encourage you to phone in. I could be wrong, but to me, these two stories sit alongside each other. You know what I'm going to do now, don't you? I'm going to unintentionally try to knit these two stories together in a creative fashion. Having started the last hour by saying from the start that we were almost certain to fail, I've already done something very similar at the start of the second hour. So the Trades Unions Congress, the TUC, has released a figure which I goggled at. It said a staggering 66% of employees on 0 hours contracts have been with their current firm for over a year. 12% have been there for over 10 years. So that's 12% of people who've been working for the same company for over 10 years but have absolutely no rights or protections whatsoever. 66% of employees on 0 hours contracts have been with their current firm for over a year. So the so-called flexibility that these contracts are supposed to allow are, in these cases, applying only to the employers. And there is a conversation to be had, I think, about what that is actually like. I've told you this before. It was a Viz cartoon that brought it home to me. It was a Viz cartoon. I presume it was one of Barney Farmer's, because I love his work. I mean, I love all of his work, but particularly in the context of the cartoons that he writes for Viz, most famously the Drunken Bakers, perhaps. But he's a poet as well. He's a fascinating fella. And he did a cartoon with his, it must have been him, with his collaborator, whose name I've temporarily forgotten. His Christian name is Lee. Is it Headley? I don't know. But anyway, they did a strip for Viz, which is still a thing, by the way, and is still brilliant. If you read it in your youth and thought that you'd grown up, I promise you haven't. If you buy it again now, you'll still love it. Roger's Profanosaurus is still going. Did you know that? They're still coming up with new rude words. Sort of 30, 40 years later after they started collating them. But they did a strip that just had a lad on a train. I don't know why. For some reason, the train was in Manchester in my imaginations. Do you do that sometimes when you're looking at a story, you're listening to a story, or you're looking at pictures, like a graphic novel or a cartoon strip, and somehow your brain puts in some of the context? I've got no idea. I must have been spending a lot of time in Manchester at the time because the trams are up there. So there's a lad on a train or a tram in what I took to be Manchester, and he goes to work, and he's skint. And he gets to work. It was only a 3 or 4 frame strip, if memory serves. And he gets to work, and his boss tells him that they don't need him today and sends him home. And I am so privileged, and I don't use that word lightly. I use it often, but I think deeply about what it means. Privilege is a negative. You're grateful for privilege, but the negative side of it is the way in which it can insulate you from and blind you to other people's realities. So white privilege is the most obvious example in current parlance, in current popular parlance. But I am so privileged that I responded to that almost viscerally. I responded to that by thinking that is absolutely disgusting. And when I talked to you about it on air, and when I shared with you much more recently the story of being in a restaurant eating a bowl of noodles when the manageress came over and sent one of the chefs home, I mentioned this to you earlier this week. It only happened about 6 months ago. And I said to one of the other chefs, because it's like an open kitchen, I'm sitting at the bar eating my noodles, and I said, will he get paid for the rest of the shift? Which is obviously a stupid question. Of course he won't get paid, otherwise she wouldn't have sent him home. We've got too many chefs in, so one of you needs to go home. And he clocks off on his way out the door. So he's come to work that morning expecting to do an 8-hour shift, and he's been sent home after 2. So he's 6 hours down on the day. That's what a 0 hours contract looks like. And the reason I was naive stroke enormously privileged is that many people told me that was completely normal. That was completely normal for you. Which makes it very difficult for me now to invite you to ring in and talk about struggling to make ends meet on £60,000 a year. But And the bit that I can't do, the area where I lack the creativity to knit these two stories together, is the area in which I feel sorry for both people. I don't think I feel equally sorry for both people, but I could come pretty close to it, oddly, because we all live within or without our means. And if our means are not excessive, then it is very easy to live without them. So if you think about interest rates going up or the cost of living going up, then even if you're on almost double the national average income, you're also on almost double the national average outcome or outgoings. So 60 grand a year to a lot of people sounds like an awful lot of money. To a much, much smaller amount of people, it sounds like a pittance. And to many people, it sounds roughly normal. A study by the Aberdeen Financial Fairness Trust, which has been set up by a fund manager, so you need to be aware of this, but it's properly and rigorously reported, The insecure jobs market and the high housing costs are leaving what we would previously have thought of as the middle class in a precarious position, struggling to maintain a decent living standard on household incomes as high as £60,000 a year. So people earning between £30,000 and £60,000 a year, depending on the type of household, we would mostly expect to be doing okay. And I think people earning a lot more than that and a lot less than that would expect them to be doing okay, right? And crucially, you would expect yourself to be doing okay. When you look at the numbers, you think you should be winning. And there's privilege kicking in here, but I find that segment of society fascinating. I think your empathy evolves as you get older, doesn't it? So Martin Amis used to suffer from something called tramp angst, which he genuinely feared waking up on a bench one day. There's a story about 10 years ago about a former television presenter. He'd been quite a big cheese at the time, and his life went a bit off track, and he did indeed end up sleeping on a bench. I've got a feeling it was on a seafront, possibly on the south coast. And that fed my tramp angst. So I often, as an adult, have had that fear of everything going wrong. Literally everything just rolling away from you. I don't know why, probably because I started therapy a few years ago. I don't have that anymore. I'm in a much healthier place emotionally. But I get it. I know what it is. I know what tramp angst is. But your empathy evolves. So I can't quite imagine, at the age of 52, being on a 0 hours contract. Even though plenty of 52-year-olds are, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've been a journalist for 25. So I've been comfortably off now for half of my adult life, for almost all of my life when I was responsible for myself and latterly for others. So I can't quite get my head around being on a 0 hours contract. That's why I think I had I don't think it was an overreaction, but I had a weird reaction to witnessing something that you considered commonplace when I saw that chef being sent home from that noodle restaurant. And I thought, well, what does he do if he's spent? What if he's spent the 6 hours' wages that he's now not going to get? I just found it, as I say, I found it stunning. But I can imagine not having enough to meet my bills at the end of the month. I can imagine that. If interest rates hit 1980s levels, I can imagine not being able to meet my mortgage payments. You know, if they go up to 18, 19% or something like that. And yet, if I were to tell you how much I earn, you would find the idea of me struggling to make ends meet just absurd to the point of obnoxiousness. But if interest rates went north 100 miles an hour, I would be in trouble, because my income and my outgoings are fairly closely aligned to each other. So I get this. And I'm not saying I empathise more. I'm saying I find it easier to imagine being a member of the precarious middle classes than I do being a 0 hours worker. And such is the nature of the chip on my shoulder that I would normally, if I was choosing between these two stories, I would go into bat for the 0 hours workers. I would now be fulminating at this microphone about how exploitative this is, how wrong this is, how disgusting it is that people do not have any rights, any protections in the workplace. And we will do again, and we may do tomorrow or on Friday, because I find the story fascinating. And the reality of what it's like to get to work and be sent home again is something that I want to explore further and have people give out more insight into. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the middle-class families struggling to live on £60,000 a year, because it would be so easy to mock. And it would be so easy to laugh. And it would be so easy to almost dismiss this as a ludicrous complaint. But it isn't. It's Mr. Micawber, isn't it? It's, income £5 a year, outgoings £4.99, result happiness. Income £5 a year, outgoings £5 and a penny a year, result unhappiness. I must get that quote correct, actually, before I use it for the 757th time this year alone. So what's that like? What's it like to not quite understand what the numbers have done to you? David knows what I'm talking about. I'm on 65 grand a year, James. I have 2 sons at university. I've never earned as much, but I've never been so cash poor. I appreciate that we're doing okay relative to some other people, but it's not a lot. And yet, to people on the national average income, which I think is currently around 35, it's almost double. It sounds like a fortune. Imagine if they doubled your wages. What would you do? Your life would be wonderful. Except that it wouldn't. If they doubled your wages, then by this time next year, you'd be living just within your new means, I think. So what's that like? 0345 60 973. What's it like to be, if you can just step back from the outgoings and focus exclusively on the incomings, and you think, yeah, I'm well off. But you know that if you were to tell somebody how much you earn and then complain about how hard you're finding it, they would probably not be sympathetic. Well, no, you would probably not expect them to be sympathetic. But I bet they would be. The other problem is the circles in which you mix, I think. So if you're on 65 grand a year, like David, you've probably got mates on 100 grand a year. So you're keeping up with them. You tell your mates on 40 grand a year that you're struggling on 65 grand a year, and they are unlikely to reach for their violins. But one of the reasons why you're struggling on 65 grand a year is because you are living in a world where people on 100 grand a year are operating. And I'm not talking about living on avocados or having 47 Netflix subscriptions. I'm talking about paying your mortgage, paying your rent, paying your bills, coping with the cost of living. And that's what I want to hear about. I want to hear about the reality of earning what you and many others would consider to be a good scratch, a good income, a good salary, but you are generally struggling, genuinely even struggling, because I have a feeling that this might be a crucial constituency at the next election to whom neither party is really currently speaking. So on paper, you're earning a good salary. In reality, you are genuinely struggling to make ends meet. You must be among the loneliest people in the world because you suffer in silence and fear that if you were to speak out, you'd be laughed at. Well, I won't laugh at you. I just want to know what it's like. I suspect the numbers are fairly huge. 0345 60 973 is the number you need. So on paper, the numbers are good. You're earning a good whack. You tell some of your friends on much less what you're earning and they think you're Croesus. They think you're loaded. But actually, privately, you're doing the sums at the end of the month and you're running out of money before you've run out a month. What's that like? And I think we can probably work out why it's happening, but if you've got extra insights into why it's happening are we the 6th largest economy in the world at the moment? It's a bit odd, isn't it? 20 minutes after 11 is the time. The number you need is 0345 60 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I can't imagine how lonely it is. You're earning what is, by all accounts, a really good income. But such is the state of the country after 14 years of Tory rule. You're struggling to make ends meet. And of course, not to tease you unduly, but there's another problem here, isn't there? In that, I mean, some of the statistics suggest that if you're on 60, 65 grand a year, then you are more likely to vote Tory. So you've kind of, some might say, you've kind of brought it on yourself. But not me. I would never say that. Faz is in Glasgow. Faz, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm a big fan of yours. First time on the radio.
Welcome.
So basically, I'm kind of in the same shoe as what you've been talking about. So yeah. I am making just under 60,000 a year. I'm self-employed.
Okay.
And basically, what you used to be like, I'm averaging about £1,000 a week, right?
Yeah.
By earnings. And my outgoings are £1,089 a week.
Yeah, there it is.
So that £89 a week more may not sound a lot, but obviously...
Of course it's a lot.
Over 4 weeks, it sounds mental. That is like someone who's making... I used to live a very decent comfortable lifestyle. And, £1,000 a week is a lot of money, and I used to be very grateful. But now I feel like I can't speak to my, relatives or my friends because they're on 25.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, you're in such a great place. You're making £1,000 a week. That's crazy. People like you, people like us make just, £1,500 a month. But they don't understand, because my earnings was that, I could afford a better house.
You cut your cloth. You went out and you thought, what's the best house I can buy reasonably on the income I've got? So you did that, and then the cost of that house went through the roof.
Yep. So tripled. My mortgage used to be £389, and now it is £932.
So anyone, whatever they're on, unless they're earning so much money they're completely insulated from chop and change, should just ask themselves what would happen to you if you had to find £600 a month more every month right now, and that's before we've even mentioned energy bills and the cost of living.
There isn't how do you even just to £600 is just obviously, as you said, energy bill isn't included, council tax rises isn't included, insurance isn't included. It's at least about £1,700 extra a month. Every month you need to find.
Well, there it is. What does what are you waiting for most? Interest rates to come back down, but because you won't be able to renegotiate your mortgage on the day that they do. What does the light at the end of the tunnel look like?
More work.
Just do more hours if you can. More work.
Yeah, 15 more hours a week I'm doing, and that's covering, and I'm saving maybe about 50, 60 quid a week.
In order to make up the shortfall between the what you'd normally be spending in bills. And I was speaking very sensitively when I suggested it must be a very lonely space to be. You've already touched on that by saying I can't really talk to my friends about it, certainly not my friends and family who are earning less than I am, because I look like the winner around that table.
Yeah. They say, oh, you got a nice big house, nice car. What else do you want? I'm like, well, the thing is, life isn't just about making 60k and spending 61k a year or spending £59,000 a year. There is more to life. That's what I'm trying them to understand. Yeah. That maybe 25k, and if your expenditures are 15k a year, you're well off. You're more.
Well, this is it. You've done it. This is you. This Charles Dickens wrote this probably the middle of the 19th century. He wrote annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, 19 and 6. Result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6. Result misery.
Yeah,
and there it is. Yeah. I guess credit's a bit easier to get by these days, and you end up building up debt, waiting for the tide to come back in again. But yeah, that failure, that lack of company, if you like, that's partly why we're doing this today, just so everybody, and the phones have gone predictably bonkers. But I just want everyone to feel a little bit less alone. And some people, of course, will go even further. We are a couple in our early 30s, James. Between the two of us, we earn over £100,000. But we're still paying student loans 14 years later. We've got fixed pensions contributions, one child in full-time nursery, a small mid-terrace house that's one storm away from major repair bills for the roof. Mortgage is up to £1,500 because of interest raises, and we're paying £1,300 every month for the nursery. We're not poor, but the outgoings go up and up with no change to the income. Everyone thinks we should be wealthy, but we really aren't. And there's no financial help from the family at any point, which compounds our financial situation compared to a lot of our peers. And again, you could say, well, sell your car, but you'd run at a loss and you've still got to buy a new one. And you'd have lost a ton of money on the old one. It's rarely that simple, and it soon runs out. And keeping up with your friends and your neighbours, it makes you even less likely to speak openly about it. It may well be that there are loads of people on the school run who are in the same position that you're in, and yet none of you ever talk about it because you don't want them to know that you are. And on it goes. B points out the middle classes having a knock-on effect will also hit charities. It's all about counting, James. They'll no longer have spare cash to donate, so the charities will have to make up the shortfall from the upper echelons. This will also hit employers such as retail. It's a major mess waiting to happen. I point you to the Sam Vines theory. Seems appropriate that as we cite Charles Dickens, B cites Terry Pratchett. The Sam Vines theory is the theory of boots. Do you know it? It's one of the most beautiful encapsulations of the difference between wealth and poverty that you will ever encounter in your life. And if you haven't heard it before, you're in for a treat, because I'll tell you exactly what it is after the latest headlines with Thomas Watt.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
26 minutes to 12 is the time. Just in terms of the numbers alone, looking at the annual, if you take the annual inflation rate at 2.5% over the last 10 years, and if you were earning 60,000 in 2013, you'd need to be earning 77,000 today, or last year specifically, to be living the same lifestyle. If you were earning 60,000 in 2013, I beg your pardon, in 2003, you'd need to be earning 98,000 today to be living the same lifestyle. So when you read that report finds precarious middle class struggling to live on £60,000 a year, trust me, it is not as fanciful as it may seem. So there's the Micawber principle. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, 19 and 6, result happiness. I don't know how you see Micawber if you've read David Copperfield. How do you see him? It normally depends on which adaptation you've seen. Did Timothy Spall play Micawber at some point? I've got a sort of a very well upholstered. It's a curious character. Well, Dickens writes such nuanced and complex characters, but I've sort of got Micawber as a sort of quite a jolly. I don't know why I've got him as a bit northern. I don't think he is northern, but in my mind's eye, annual income £20, annual expenditure £19, 19 and 6, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6, result misery. I love that. It's about living within your means. It doesn't matter what your means are if you're just above them. That's why Faz was such a great caller. But I want to give you this from Terry Pratchett, because this is a thing of beauty. The reason that the rich were so rich, Vimes reasoned, was because they managed to spend less money. Take Boots, for example. He earned $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50. But an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kind of boots Vimes always bought and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Ankh-Morpork on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that would still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man who could only afford a cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. This was the Captain Samuel Vine's boots theory of socio-economic unfairness. And it plays beautifully into that lazy, stupid Tory rhetoric about getting on your bike or cancelling your Netflix or eating fewer avocados. Because if you can afford the £50 boots, you have no idea what life is like for the people in £10 boots. You're applying your own economic parameters and experiences to a reality you do not inhabit, which is how you can end up saying something like, I can't believe it. I've people struggling with the cost of living. Did you know that some supermarkets have a value range? I mean whole aisles of cheap stuff that doesn't have fancy pictures on the labels, but it's got beans inside the tin. And you actually had a Tory, I always forget which one it was, coming out with something like that last year. So what's it like to be struggling when, according to the figures, you really, really shouldn't be? According to the society in which you live, you really, really shouldn't be. Katie is in Ivor. Katie, what would you like to say?
Hi, morning.
Hello.
So we are in your bracket. We're both full-time working parents. We've got 2 children. We worked hard to get our deposit together because that's what you do. You go, you get a deposit and you want to buy a house. We've got a nice house, don't get me wrong, but over the years, because we're working parents, one, we don't get any help because of the price, because of the range we're in. So, for instance, we have to pay £2,500 to get our children on a school bus, whereas if we earned less, we wouldn't. Now, I'm not saying that we want to earn less, but we'd be much better off now because next year our mortgage comes up. God, it's already £1,800 a month. Don't know what it's going to be next year. We'd be better off both going, let's quit our jobs, let's lose our house, try and go and get some housing somewhere. But what does that show our children?
I don't quite follow you. I've got enormous sympathy for what you describe, but you're suggesting that if you gave up work, you'd somehow be better off.
I mean, next year we might not have a choice to lose our house.
Yeah.
What do we do then? We could go back into rented accommodation, but even that, how do you get a? It
just seems to me, I'll choose my words very carefully, but you're doing that thing that they need you to do for this to carry on happening, Katie. You're about to tell me about someone you know on benefits who's better off than you are, aren't you?
Well, no, not necessarily.
Yeah,
I mean, I've got a twin sister. She's on benefits. She does have more money than us, but she doesn't have what we have.
Right.
You know, she doesn't have a choice. We
she's
have
disabled.
a choice. Well, she's got lots of different things, but she doesn't have a choice where she lives. You know, she's got a nice house.
But imagine I was listening to this. I'm a Conservative politician, the sort of person you voted for. And I'm sitting there thinking, what can I do to make people like Katie blame someone else for the fact that they're struggling? And they'd be listening to this, rubbing their hands with glee. Wouldn't they?
I mean, the reason
I could give up my work now and sign on and be better off than I am. So already the unfair distribution of wealth that you're on the wrong end of, you're blaming on people who've got even less than you. They don't even own their own homes.
Because I think they look at us and look at our this bracket and think, well, you're okay. You've got a house.
Who does?
Well, we have.
Who does? Who looks at you and thinks that?
I think a lot of society, a lot of people that don't own their own homes, even people that rent.
So now you're talking about jealousy.
Well, I suppose.
Why do you keep looking down?
Jealousy.
So you're describing your struggle, and the only way you're looking is down. Isn't that odd when you think about it?
I don't know where to go with it. Next year.
Well, why aren't you looking up? Why aren't you thinking, how come he's got so much? The Prime Minister's worth, along with his wife, £600 or £700 million, and you're cross with your disabled sister.
Well, I'm not cross with her. She'd kill me.
Right.
No, I'm cross.
Just slow down a bit. Have a think. Why are you talking about people who've got even less than you when you're unhappy with what you've got, instead of talking about people who've got more? Take your time, seriously. Just because I don't think you've ever asked yourself that question before.
No, I suppose not. I suppose because we're in that bracket of we work full time, we try and try and try and try.
Yeah.
Yet we still might lose our house.
Yeah. But lots of people have lost their houses who also work incredibly hard. It's not the fault of the people who've got less than them, who've never owned a house, is it? Like you said, we could go back to renting, but what would that tell our children? So why have you never looked up when you're thinking, like, this isn't fair, this isn't right? You're looking at the people who've got even less than you instead of the people that have got more. It's just weird when you think about it.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah, I've never really thought about it like that. Why were we not saying, well, the people that, the taxis and things like that.
Do you think you ever will again?
Maybe now.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Could we remember bringing in tax cuts for people like me earning over £100,000 a year? How can that be right? How can that be fair?
I suppose we've always been kind of conditioned into blaming people that don't work.
Exactly. And that's not your fault.
Maybe we should be looking at the people that
do.
Aren't paying the taxes.
Yeah, or just getting quite an easy ride from things, or paying a smaller percentage on their income from money they make on shares than the income that they make from working. So Rishi Sunak pays less tax on the profits he makes from his shares than he does on the money that he actually earns. The percentage on capital gains is lower than income tax. So if he's got £1 million worth of shares, the tax he pays on the profits, the money he gets for doing nothing, except sitting there and waiting for the checks to arrive, the percentage rate of tax he pays on that is lower than what you and your husband pay on your income.
Well, one thing I'm pleased about ringing in for today is because you could, hopefully me and a lot of other people will look at it in a completely different way.
I hope so. I do. And thank you for letting me, because I was conscious of perhaps being a little bit patronising. But it's so easy, like you said, to fall into the trap of thinking, and we haven't even mentioned foreigners or immigrants, but we won't today, but falling into the trap of thinking it's their fault that things are going badly for me. And I swear to you, listening to you in Downing Street going, yeah, we got her. She's there. There it is. There's a quote by a Welsh politician called Aneurin Bevan who describes the triumph of 20th century conservatism as persuading poverty to use their power, wealth persuading poverty to use their power to keep wealth in power. And I'm not suggesting that you fit into the category of poverty, but persuading people to use their democratic power to perpetuate an unfairness that they actually suffer from is indeed the definition of the last 124 years or so of British politics. Katie, take care, and I hope things pick up for you. I really do. I hope the House isn't in any form of jeopardy. It's coming up to 11:45. I thought we would catch up shortly with the journalist at the Sunday Times whose interview with Henry Staunton, the outgoing head of the Post Office, has kicked off a remarkable war of words with the infamous computer hacker Kemi Badenoch. And then, of course, PMQs is on the way. So quite a fun-packed 45 minutes ahead of us. I may hopefully have time for another call or two on this because it is a fascinating subject. It really is. It's coming up to 11:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. And immediately after the break, I will tell you. I nearly did this internationally. I said, there's a headline in the newspaper today. It says, blank is one of the world's most poisoned rivers. I was going to go, is it A, the Ganges, B, the Nile, or C, and then I was going to say an English river. But I didn't. I did 3 English rivers. In retrospect, I probably got it wrong, but it would have been obvious which one I was talking about if I'd done it the other way. So is it A, the Mersey, that is one of the world's most poisoned rivers, B, the Thames, or C, the Severn? I will tell you immediately after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:49 is the time. It's a tough call. Who do you trust? The woman who has boasted about hacking I think the parliamentary computer of Harriet Harman, or a man that was running the post office until she sacked him, a man who has a very, very long and illustrious track record at the very highest levels of British business, working for Granada, actually, as it became a behemoth on the domestic commercial stage. I refer to the developing battle between Henry Staunton, former chairman of the Post Office, and Kemi Badenoch, the Secretary of State for Business. And it is a battle that began in the pages of the Sunday Times as a consequence of an interview conducted by their associate editor and leader writer, Oliver Shah. I always ask people this question, Oliver, and it's an illustration of what a rubbish journalist I am more than anything else. But when you wrote up the interview, did you realise quite what you were starting?
Hi, James. Yes is the short answer.
I knew it.
I sort of talked it through with Henry over a cup of tea a couple of times on a couple of occasions. So we've been over the detail quite thoroughly, and it was obvious to me the first time I heard what he had to say that it was fairly incendiary stuff, given the backdrop of the 900 or so sub-postmasters and others who were wrongly pursued over the glitches in the Horizon system, and the fact that so little compensation has so far been paid out. I mean, the main claim that he was ordered early on in his tenure by a senior civil servant to slow compensation claims and limp quote marks into the election was pretty remarkable stuff. Indeed,
and the rationale behind the alleged advice or the alleged order was to keep it off the balance sheet, essentially, in the run up to the general election.
Yeah, that was what he gave me to understand. And I mean, he also made various other comments. You know, he said the culture remained toxic, that there was still a belief in the upper echelons of the post office that some postmasters were guilty as charged. He said Nick Reed, the CEO, had lobbied Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, in January after the ITV Mr. Bates drama came out to say that convictions shouldn't be overturned. So it was a real kind of opening of the kimono on a load of stuff that you don't usually hear in a senior person.
So while you appreciated the gravity of his allegations, have you been surprised by the tone of Kemi Badenoch's response?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised at how fiercely she came out against it, and I mean, it was already a smouldering fire, and she tipped petrol on it, really, in terms of accusing Henry Staunton of lying and making her Commons statement on Monday saying that everything he'd said was completely false. And he's since produced a memo, which he wrote to himself at the time in January last year after his first meeting with Sarah Munby, who was then the top civil servant in the business department, where he claims that she told him to hobble into the next election and reduce spending wherever possible, and said that politicians often don't like dealing with reality.
And I mean, just for fans of detail, it's a contemporaneous note because by sending it to himself, it is date stamped, of course.
Yeah, that's the key thing, isn't it? I mean, people, recollections may vary after the event, but having a note that was taken at the time before, a year before he was fired, when he wouldn't have had an axe to grind against the government, or before even Kemi Badenoch was appointed business secretary, is quite significant.
So what does clarity look like? What does full clarity look like, and are we likely to achieve it?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? Because these are verbal remarks traded between individuals over a year ago now. So beyond contemporaneous notes, it's a question of one person's word against another. I think the bigger backdrop that people are pointing out is there's a war of words going on now, but compensation levels to sub-postmasters are still very low. And Alan Bates, the hero of the ITV drama, still feels, I'm paraphrasing, but I think he feels he's being nickel and dimed, or attempted to be nickel and dimed on compensation. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, isn't it? And the truth is, a lot of sub-postmasters still have not been compensated.
And you, of course, stand by your story.
Yeah, I mean, I took the view that it's our job to report accurately and honestly what people say, and I'm not particularly taking sides, but I'm simply relaying. I thought it was in the public interest to relay what Henry Staunton had to say, and to do it in a balanced, calm way, and I included all the government's rebuttals of what he said, and all the responses from different parties like Post Office and UKGI, which manages taxpayers' stake. And I think it's our job to bring things to light and relay them as faithfully and transparently as we can.
Which you continue to do with reference to the memo you've just alluded to. You quote a government source as saying, even if we trust the veracity of a memo he wrote himself, and there's not much to suggest we can, given the false accusations he made about the Secretary of State in his original interview, it's time for Henry Staunton to admit his interview was a misrepresentation. There'd be, parliamentary privilege quite helpful to Kemi Badenoch, given the strength of some of the things that she said.
Yeah, I mean, Henry Staunton has seemed quite sanguine when I've spoken to him, but it was quite remarkable, as you say, broadside against his character by Kemi Badenoch. And I was kind of surprised, given that she wasn't really the subject of the first interview he gave.
Well, exactly. Do you think she didn't realise that? I mean, sorry, I'm asking you to speculate unduly now, but it was as if she thought she'd been personally attacked, whereas she hadn't.
As you say, it's hard to say what's in her mind, isn't it? I mean,
yes, it is.
The newspaper version was dressed up with a big picture of her, and there was an element of him claiming to relay details of the call when she fired him. So
yes.
Maybe she was angered by that. I don't know, but it's hard to say quite why she seems to have taken it so personally.
Well, we may never know. Is there more to come, or do you think we've peaked?
Well, Henry Staunton is in front of the business select committee next week,
of course.
So
watch
I
this
think.
space.
They're going to be very interested to go over this stuff, aren't they, and try to interrogate it. And I wonder whether he will find any more files in his archives before then.
Oliver Shaw, thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us. Oliver, as I mentioned, the associate editor and leader writer at the Sunday Times, whose interview with Henry Staunton has prompted this extraordinary war of words where, to use Oliver's characterisation of it, Henry Staunton, whose CV is extraordinary. He's the kind of fellow who could have been sitting next to Alan Sugar on The Apprentice, except even more impressive, has remained remarkably sanguine, while Kemi Badenoch, if Kemi Badenoch was a man, I'd describe her as hysterical, but she's not, so I won't. She's been behaving in an incredibly, let's just say, excitable fashion. And as he says, it will have to wait for this select committee hearing to get to the bottom, or to get nearer the bottom of what has or has not unfolded. It's the River Mersey. Well, there's some rude text coming in now. I don't think it... Also, you don't need to talk about me in the third person. You don't have to say, flippin' heck, he's forgotten already, and then write Rivers in capital letters, because it's me. You can write you for... I read these messages myself. It's not the BBC. There's not 48 people going through my tweets and texts before someone hands me a piece of paper with 3 written on them. I see it all. The horror, the hate, the viciousness, the accusations, the allegations, but that one's really got under my skin. What do you mean he's forgotten already? I'm here, I'm real, I'm in the room. It was the River Mersey. I should give you a bit more detail on this story, shouldn't I? The River Mersey catchment area has some of the highest levels of forever chemicals in the world. Much of them sewage treatment works, have come from sewage treatment works, scientists have found. So much of the focus on polluted rivers looks at things like E. coli and nutrient pollutants, including nitrogen. But chemical contamination is emerging as a major health concern. And the River Mersey, to paraphrase Boris Johnson, is world-beating. Yikes. So now you know. I don't know what state other English rivers are in, actually. They should probably tell us, but there is it's the third worst in the world after the Tokyo Basin and Cape Fear in North Carolina. I think they need a new name. Forever Chemicals sounds a bit sweet. It's like a forever home. You don't want to talk about forever chemicals. You want to talk about eternal toxicity or something like, we've got some forever chemicals. Sounds lovely. Forever chemicals. It's like a children's series. No, it's awful. And we're the third worst in the world after the Tokyo Basin and Cape Fear in North Carolina. I'll talk about sweets later. It's all good. Thanks for the reminder. It's coming up to 11:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I may take a couple more calls. I don't have anything currently scheduled for 12:45. So I may take a couple more calls on that, I think, hugely significant story of people on outwardly good salaries who are really struggling. And we're also going to be visited by Keir Starmer's biographer. It's an authorised biography of Keir Starmer that is... Well, with a few extraordinary exceptions, political books generally don't sell very well in this country. But if a lot of people read it, their view of Keir Starmer would probably change. There's one exchange in particular regarding his late father, which was positively poignant. But Tom Baldwin, the author, will join us after past. I've got nothing scheduled for 12:45, so we may take a few more calls on that question of an outwardly impressive income upon which you are struggling to live. And whoever you are, is it sending me this message? Sam, you send me this every day. Please check out a guy called Gary Stevenson. You'll find him very interesting. He explains everything very well. Sam, he's on Full Disclosure next week, mate. So that's covered. Guess who's on this week? Natasha Clark. Guess who's on Full Disclosure this week? I should probably give you a clue. American.
Any American political figure.
An American politician who's particularly interesting.
The nice New York lady.
No.
Right, I don't know them.
All right.
Come on.
This was fun.
You need to give me a little bit better than that.
I'm supposed to build up to Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
I'm sitting down. I'm
pretty
sitting
good.
down with Bernie Sanders. Imminently. Anyway, PMQs. Back to Blighty. What's going to happen today? I've got no idea. Have you?
Recession. We're in a recession.
I forgot. Yeah.
Or as the Labour Party might like to say, a Rishi session.
Recession.
Does it work?
Rishi session. They don't really do that sort of thing. Although I love the thing they did with his phone. Did you see that?
Oh yeah, that was very funny.
That was absolutely extraordinary. But
that was very funny.
We shall. So recession will come in, and he will say, "At least I've got a plan, and you haven't."
Oh, as in the Prime Minister, yes. At least he will say that, yes. Also, I wonder if we will see the Kemi Staunton row emerge. And there is a lot of, obviously, he said, she said. She sells on the seashore. Exactly. There is a lot of that. So I wonder whether we will have anything from Sir Keir Starmer sort of laying the boot into any of these accusations. It's hard to know what Sunak could say, really, isn't it? And I mean, he probably... Well, yeah, you may be right, because Sunak may not want to throw the full weight of his support behind her, while the possibility that Staunton's telling the truth remains alive. Very much alive. Exactly, but Kemi Badenoch's staunch defence of him in the Commons, you saw how animated and quite furious she was earlier this week when she came to try. She's called him a liar on Twitter. There's this pretty fruity language being thrown around. She's not protected, of course, by parliamentary privilege on Twitter. So recession, maybe a bit of Badenoch. Wonder if he might go on the Border Force chief yesterday. David Neil forced to quit. There's lots of reports into some quite embarrassing Home Office revelations that have yet to emerge. David Neil has been sacked. He was due to go in a month, wasn't he? So he's just been shown the door a little early. But the allegation is that private jets are landing in the country at a rate, the kind of things that Rishi Sunak likes to fly around the country in, are landing in the country at a rate of knots without being subject to the kind of checks that you would expect on a commercial flight. So, I mean, what would be... Are they suggesting that people have been making their way to the country illegally on private jets, like a sort of VIP small boat? Potentially, but just it exposes the state of the border system. Exactly, which is exactly what an independent border force chief would say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the new member for Wellingborough and the new member for Kingswood? I know they will both be powerful advocates for their constituents. On a more sombre note, Mr. Speaker, can I join with the Prime Minister? I was glad to hear what he just had to say, because I'm sure the whole House will join me in sharing our disgust at the death of Alexei Navalny, who, as the Prime Minister said, died because of his efforts to expose the corruption of the Putin regime. It is a reminder that Putin has stolen not just the wealth, but also the future and democracy of the Russian people. Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister be prepared personally to repeat the allegation made by his business secretary that the former chair of the Post Office is lying when he says he was told to go slow on compensation for postmasters and limp to the next election?
Mr. Speaker, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. She set out the reasons for this and the full background in the House earlier this week. But importantly, we have also taken unprecedented steps to ensure that victims of the Horizon scandal do receive compensation as swiftly as possible and in full. Making sure that victims receive justice and compensation remains our number one priority, and we will shortly bring forward legislation to address this matter soon.
I'm not sure that takes us very much further forward, so let me press on, because on Monday the Business Secretary also confirmed categorically that the Post Office was, and I'll quote this in fairness to the Prime Minister, at no point told to delay compensation payments by either an official or a minister from any government department, and at no point was it suggested that a delay would be of benefit to the Treasury. So that's Monday. A note released by the former Post Office chair this morning appears to directly contradict that. And I appreciate the business. This really matters to the people who've been at the heart. I appreciate that the Business Secretary has put the Prime Minister in a tricky position. But will he commit to investigating this matter properly, including whether that categorical statement was correct and why, rather than taking those accusations seriously, she accused a whistleblower of lying?
Mr. Speaker, it is worth bearing in mind that, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. But this is, on a matter of substance, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history, because people who were working hard serving their communities had their lives and reputations destroyed, and that's why we are working hard to ensure that they get justice and compensation, and that's why we established Sir Win Williams' inquiry. It's why we've already paid out over £150 million of compensation to almost 3,000 victims, and it's why we will introduce new legislation shortly to exonerate those. We will make sure that we do what is needed, that the truth does come to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and crucially, that victims get the justice that they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, I do hope the Prime Minister will instigate that investigation into what was said on Monday, because one of the features of this miscarriage is that where concerns have been raised, they've been pushed to one side. And this week we also learned that a 2016 investigation into whether Post Office branch accounts could be altered was suddenly stopped before it was completed. Now, had that investigation revealed that they could be altered, which we now know to be the case, the livelihoods of those wrongly prosecuted could have been saved. What did government ministers know about it at the time?
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has picked one particular date, but it is worth bearing in mind that this scandal has unfolded over decades, Mr. Speaker, and it was actually following a landmark 2019 High Court case that the previous government established a statutory inquiry led by Sir Win Williams, which is uncovering exactly what went wrong, Mr. Speaker, and it is right that that inquiry is allowed to do its work. But also, Mr. Speaker, following the High Court case, the government established an independent advisory board, established not one but 3 different compensation schemes, and as of now, over 2/3 of people have received full and final offers, because what we are focused on is making sure that the victims get the justice and the compensation that they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, this information about 2016 has just come to light, I think, this week, which is precisely why I'm asking about it. Considering the Prime Minister's Foreign Secretary was running the government in 2016, and one of the Prime Minister's current Cabinet Office ministers was the Post Office Minister, has he thought to ask either of them what they knew in 2016?
No, Mr. Speaker. We did the right thing, which was to set up an independent statutory inquiry. That is the right way to resolve this issue. It's the right way to get victims the truth and the answers that they demand. But this government is getting them the compensation that they rightly deserve.
Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the Horizon scandal left people isolated, their livelihoods lost, their lives ruined. Some died without ever getting the justice that they deserved. Fears of delay, Prime Minister, or cover-up are causing them anguish. And yesterday, Chris Head, once accused by the Post Office of owing more than £80,000, he said this yesterday: there is a lack of transparency. We need to see the correspondence between the Post Office, the Department and UKGI, because all of the time everything gets shrouded in secrecy. This is his words. Have some respect, please. He's a victim. Now, I appreciate the inquiry is ongoing, but as the Prime Minister knows, and so do I, so does the whole House, that does not provide a reason why he can't draw a line under this, give postmasters like Chris the peace of mind they need, and release all of the correspondence that he wants to see. Will he now do so?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, this is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our country's history. I don't think that the Leader of the Opposition ever raised with me over these exchanges over the past year. But we are working hard to get victims not just the answers, but the compensation they deserve. But we do now have a statutory inquiry led by Sir Win Williams, who has the powers to get access to all the documentation that he requires, speak to everybody that he needs to. That is the right and proper way to get the truth that the victims deserve. But in the meantime, we are not wasting a moment to get victims the compensation they deserve, and the legislation will be before the House shortly.
In recent decades, there have been numerous scandals that have shaken public faith in our institutions, and rebuilding that confidence will require those affected to see that politicians are being honest with them and to believe it. Just like the postmasters, victims of the infected blood scandal have been subject to unimaginable trauma during their search for justice. So can the Prime Minister put their minds at ease and tell the House what undertakings he has made to ensure the government is not limping to the election on payments that they are owed by the British state?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the inflected blood scandal, as I've said before, I'm acutely aware of the strength of feeling on this issue and the suffering of all those who were impacted by this dreadful scandal. I gave evidence to the inquiry myself last year, and as I said then, I recognise that thousands have suffered for decades. As he knows, there is an independent inquiry. The Minister for the Cabinet Office, because this is an incredibly complex issue, as he well knows, updated Parliament with the latest government position just before the Christmas recess, announced that the Cabinet Office was appointing an expert group of clinical, legal and social care experts, so it had the relevant expertise to make informed decisions responding to the inquiry's recommendations on compensation when they come, and confirmed that the Department for Health will implement a fully bespoke psychological service for people infected and affected. We have also committed to providing an update to Parliament on next steps through an oral statement within 25 sitting days of the publication of the final report. But I'll end where I began. This is a deeply awful scandal, and we will do what we need to make it right.
McCartney. Thank you, Speaker. There is a plan for at least 2,000 single young men who have come here illegally to soon be housed just 3 miles from the centre of Lincoln at RAF Scampton in my right honourable friend's constituency of Gainsborough, if the Home Office ministers have their way. On top of the huge and rising costs and recent advice from civil servants to Home Office ministers to can the plan, what reassurance can the Prime Minister and his Home Secretary give that Scampton will not replicate the scandalous incidences that occurred in Cambridge when 300 Libyan trainees were housed at RAF Bassingbourn in 2014?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise the concerns of his constituents, and I want to assure him that we want asylum accommodation to have as little impact as possible on the local community. I understand the Home Office has put in place a number of measures, including a specialist security provider working on site 24/7, CCTV, and they're working with the local police as well. But I know he agrees with me that the only way to fully stop this problem and ensure that local communities are not seeing the housing of illegal migrants, whether that's in large sites or in hotels, is to have a plan to stop the boats. That's what this party and this government does, and it's Labour who are blocking us every step of the way.
Stephen Flynn, SNP leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by echoing the sentiments of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in relation to the heroic bravery of Alexei Navalny. We all must continue to be united in our opposition to Vladimir Putin. Mr. Speaker, as it stands, some 60% of the buildings in Gaza are either damaged or destroyed. Much of the farmland is in ruin. Some 30,000 people are dead, 70,000 injured, and 1.4 million people are currently sheltering in Rafah, awaiting an imminent Israeli onslaught. Surely the Prime Minister must accept that that does not amount to self-defence.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share the concern of many members about the high rate of civilian casualties and indeed the growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and that is why we have called consistently for an immediate humanitarian pause, which would allow for the safe release of hostages and more aid going into Gaza so that we create the sustainable conditions for a long-term and enduring ceasefire. That is what our diplomatic efforts are focused on, and that is what I impressed upon the Israeli Prime Minister last week when I spoke to him.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, tonight this House will have the opportunity to join with the majority of the international community and say that enough is enough, that the killing in Gaza must stop and that the hostages must be released. And the best way to do that is to send a clear and united message that we back an immediate ceasefire. Surely all of us, irrespective of our political allegiance, can agree on that very issue.
Mr. Speaker, of course we want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible and never again allow Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks that Israel was subject to. But he talks about the UN resolution, but just calling for an immediate full ceasefire now, which collapses back into fighting within days or weeks, is not in anyone's interest, Mr. Speaker. We must work towards a permanent ceasefire, and that's why the right approach is the approach that we've set out and the United States have set out in their resolution, which is for an immediate humanitarian pause to get hostages out and aid in so that we then can create the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire. And in the meantime, we're doing everything we can to increase the amount of humanitarian aid that we bring into Gaza, something I discussed with the King of Jordan last week, and we will have more updates in the coming days of more airdrops into Gaza, but also just in the last couple of days have managed to deliver family tents into Gaza, which are providing much needed shelter for very vulnerable people.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Key to the much-needed regeneration of Aylesbury are new link roads to cut congestion.
The time is 16 minutes after 12. We will return imminently to pick over the bones of this week's PMQs. Well, I think Natasha Clark got her best record yet on predicting what was likely to come up.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 19 minutes after 12. I actually said this, Ollie, in Oxford to Natasha during that. Starmer's questioning is reminiscent of how he questioned Johnson over Partygate. A nice long game approach on this. Not a lot to balance that out, I'm afraid, in the inbox this week. Sunak is sounding very flat in his replies, almost like he's got no confidence in confirming things and isn't willing to push his agenda. He is almost sombre. Another text goes a little further and says, does everyone seem a bit sleepy today, James, or is it just me? I presume you're referring to PMQs, or maybe you're just in the park. And Sunak doesn't actually sound like he believes a thing he says. He sounds like a man treading water. And this one is coming at 12:16. Is it the River Severn, James? No, it's the River bloody Mersey. I told you 20 minutes ago. Honestly, you're listening on catch up. You've pressed rewind on Global Player and now you're answering questions that I've already answered. I can't be held responsible. I can only conduct the programme in one time-space continuum. I cannot conduct the programme in all the different time-space continuums that are unfolding as a consequence of Global Player. And if you're watching on YouTube, again, I answered it 20... Hello, by the way. Hey, how are you? Looking great. You have to, as live. Yeah? Thank you. Well done. He went in straight on the post office, and he did indeed sound a little like he did, quite a lot like he did, when he was essentially laying a months-long trap for Boris Johnson, which Boris Johnson essentially ended up leaving the Commons as a consequence of.
Yeah, he's quite good at being a lawyer.
Yes.
Should have given that one a go in a former life. Keir Starmer in full swing lawyer mode. Yeah. But what was interesting for me was not about what Rishi Sunak said about Kemi Badenoch and about Martin Staunton, but what he didn't say. And he didn't repeat any of the allegations that Kemi Badenoch did in the House of Commons. He did not go full throttle in for Martin Staunton like she did. He didn't repeat any of that. So what does that tell us? Does that say that he's not quite sure that his business secretary is being entirely truthful? Is he happy to let her take the blame if something does go wrong? What does it say about this?
Staunton.
Sorry, Henry Staunton.
What did you say?
I said Martin. Sorry.
Who's Martin Staunton?
Apologies, Martin Staunton.
Well, have you got Martin?
No idea.
Sorry, can I just say sorry on behalf of Natasha Clark and
I'm
everyone
so sorry
at
who
LBC
Martin
to
Staunton is.
Is there a Martin Staunton? If we can find a Martin Staunton by 1 o'clock today.
I'm so sorry.
I'll give him a bag of cola bottles, which is inexplicably the fourth most popular tweet in the country. Yes.
Go back to the point. Yes, he didn't say what Kemi Badenoch said in the House of Commons, that he was he was the subject of a potential bullying allegation. He didn't repeat that.
No.
He just said, he had left after concerning behaviours were raised with him. He didn't want to go into any of the details on that. Why is that? Why doesn't Rishi Sunak feel confident to back up his business secretary? And we saw the same thing with Number 10 earlier this week. Obviously, she on Sunday tweeted that he was a liar. We asked Number 10, would you like to back that? And they pointedly refused to do so.
It's interesting. The idea that Sunak doesn't have much authority gathers momentum as a consequence of things like this. Because wasn't there a report also while they were in recess, that he had been perhaps minded to apologise to Esther Jai after doing a jibe about transgender people while she was in the building, and Kemi Badenoch's interventions on Twitter meant that he couldn't. I read that.
That was a suggestion.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. She doubled down on saying it was absolutely right for the government to go in on the political attack on Sir Keir Starmer that we saw at Prime Minister's Questions a few weeks ago, which obviously meant that he could not, if that was indeed Number 10's intention, they couldn't really row back without looking quite silly if she goes in very hard. But yes, he didn't go in very hard at all.
And he didn't repeat what she had said.
Didn't repeat any of the allegations.
In the context of the limping into the election to save the government money element of it as well. I spoke to Oliver Shah, the journalist who broke the story, just before you came into the studio, and I sort of sense that we may never get closure on this because it has a bit of a he said, she said. But my information regarding Henry Staunton is that he will have kept, because he worked for Charles Allen at Granada, who I know a bit, and if you were part of that team, you were on your tiptoes. Absolutely world-class, A-list, elite business people. So he won't have left
if that's the case, then
T's uncrossed.
Potentially, could we see some of releasing of those documents? It has Henry Staunton got proof of these phone calls that he says, has he taken these contemporaneous notes? And if so, has he handed them over to the Post Office inquiry as well? Because you'd expect that if that did happen, obviously it's now happening in real time now, I guess. And I don't know where the Post Office inquiry does draw a line and stop taking evidence, but you would expect that to be handed over. And if I were Henry Staunton, then I would also be wanting to get that out into the public domain. And he's got an appearance in front of
Business
MPs
Select Committee next
next week.
Could be very interesting.
That could be quite a lively one if he comes armed with some of that proof.
Indeedy. Are we in an era, though, now, for a whole host of reasons, some speculative, some substantive, that Sunak's not going to sack anybody, is he, before the general election, even if they are caught in fairly tepid water or hot water.
Well, look at his track record for sacking some people. It did take him a long time to sack Suella Braverman. It took him a long time to sack his long-time ally Dominic Raab as well. He doesn't like letting go of his ministers very easily. So yes, I think Kemi Badenoch obviously trying very hard to make a mark for herself, clearly, but she goes in like a wrecking ball. Unlike Suella Braverman, she doesn't want to be sacked, I don't think. I don't think so. I think she's probably quite happy and content to be within government, to be a bit of a noisy voice on the side. But if she starts becoming a thorn in his side, like Suella Braverman did, and starts speaking out like that, he might think again. But I think you're all right. I don't see him making any sort of example of her between now and the election. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, more evidence perhaps of the shallowness of the talent puddle from which Rishi Sunak is compelled to make cabinet appointments. So that went well for Starmer. Sunak did sound a little flat.
He did. He was very low energy, wasn't he?
He was very low energy.
Didn't feel like he had maybe he's on a fasting day.
Could be. Where did Starmer go next?
He used most of his questions on the post office scandal, unless I'm incorrect.
Let's look ahead.
Sorry, he did also talk about infected blood scandal as well, and payments owed, which obviously sort of moved the story
of history repeating itself in a variety of inquiries and scandals.
The problem is that obviously we didn't really get a smoking gun from Keir. Obviously he tried loyally to probe him, but we didn't really get many answers out of the Prime Minister. But neither can Keir Starmer come out of Prime Minister's questions and go, I've got you. But whether in the weeks and months to come, as more comes out about the post office, he will be able to point to that. The problem with this and the problem with going on this is that the public see both the government and the post office as equally to blame. The post office covered it up. The government didn't ask the right questions. The government didn't expose it. It's a bit of a plague on all your houses, which is actually quite a difficult political argument to make.
And David Cameron being in the chair when that panorama dropped. And I mean, you look at the effort that some of your former friends on right-wing newspapers have put into trying to malign Sir Ed Davey for being the post office minister for 19 months before the whistleblower came forward for Fujitsu. If David Cameron was a Labour politician, he'd be on top of a bonfire by now.
Well, there are many post. We've discussed this before. There are so many post office ministers of different colours that are all jointly responsible for this. Ed Davey, perhaps, is probably just the most high-profile one. He's the leader of a political party, and you've obviously, you've had him on before, and you grilled him rightly so on that.
But that whistleblowing episode came long after he had left, and it came when David Cameron was Prime Minister, which was the other thing that Starmer referred to. Let's look ahead to this. I confess, Natasha, I'm not fully across who's proposing what and who's amending the other and who's going to vote in this way, which is a shame because I don't think I'd accuse any individual or party of doing this particularly, but there's a general air, perhaps, of the ceasefire falling foul to partisan self-interest in some of the exchanges that I've seen. So what exactly is going to happen this afternoon, and how do we think particularly Labour MPs are likely to vote?
So the Labour Party have moved their position on a ceasefire. That much is evidently clear. A few months ago, when Sir Keir Starmer was last in this headache, he was not calling for a ceasefire. He was calling for a humanitarian pause, much more in line with what the government was saying, whether, you'd like to debate what the difference between a pause and a ceasefire is. The government still seems to think we should have a pause, then to talk about what a sustainable ceasefire looks like. I think for most people, it just looks like splitting hairs, doesn't it? It looks like you can't put a cigarette paper between all of these three positions. At the moment, it's the SNP who are in charge this afternoon. It's the opposition day debate, so their motion will get picked to be debated by the Speaker. We are still waiting for what the Speaker of the House of Commons, and in the next half an hour we do expect that he will say what amendments he has selected. So the government have put down their own amendment. That is quite likely to get selected. The Labour Party have also put down their own amendment. That is less likely to get selected based on convention. Will the Speaker rip up convention to try and encourage everybody to have their say today? There is a potential that could happen. There are rumours abound that the Speaker is looking at perhaps ripping up standing orders to make a bit of a big change. If that's true, then that would be quite something. But yes, I think most people in outside of Westminster will really look at those three positions and go, actually, is there much difference between all of them? And especially between the SNP position and the Labour Party. They are both very similar. Lots of people trying to play politics, aren't they?
Yes, I think so. And it's an unseemly sight given the stakes, given what is actually under discussion. But I mean, perhaps an inevitable one. Great stuff, Natasha. Thank you very much. Anything else you need to get off your chest?
think we're okay. Anything you'd like to ask me?
No, I just wondered if there's anything else coming out this afternoon that we should be...
Well, we've in the last few minutes, we've had some news about the Navalny sanctions, which we should bring to listeners, that the UK has put more sanctions on the Russian prison chiefs after the activists' deaths.
Okay.
I think there is a question, though, of how much more we can impact on Russian sanctions. We've been sanctioning Russia for 2 years. Is there any more pressure that the UK and our allies can really do by putting more sanctions on these people? How much more can we do, and will it really make any of a difference to Putin's
Could sanction
war?
Alexander Lebedev, of course, who Canada have sanctioned for being an intimate member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle, but it would, of course, be awkward for the Tory party because Boris Johnson put his son in the House of Lords. It's 12:30. Tim Humphrey has your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Keir Starmer, among the many challenges that he faces, challenges that are often typified as trying to carry that proverbial Ming vase across an ice rink, is the difficulty that he has in communicating a sense of self almost, a sense of personality. That's probably one of the reasons why he has collaborated, or certainly encouraged friends and family to collaborate with Tom Baldwin, former journalist, well, still a journalist, I suppose, former spin doctor, and now official biographer of Keir Starmer. And the book's out next week, although I'm sure it's already on the tables in the front of your local bookshop. And Tom joins me now. Why did you want to write it?
I think Keir Starmer is an unusual politician in that he's not really like a politician, and one of the reasons why he doesn't always make sense for people who write and read about politics all the time. He doesn't fit those narrow confines of what we expect from political leaders. He's not easily explainable in a single speech or soundbite or video clip. He's got a complicated story. He's a complicated person. Most people are complicated. And I think he's more like most people than politicians.
Publicly complicated. I mean, all people are privately complicated, including politicians, but we've lived in an era where being two-dimensional in public has been quite rewarding, hasn't it, for politicians, perhaps?
I think it's also part of the problem.
Yes.
I think we've built politicians up to be a single story with a single big vision and a neat little tight backstory and then some easily digestible policy pledges. And life is complicated. And until politics recognises that complexity, I think we're going to be stuck in a sort of groove of big radical visions which fail, rather than practical, value-driven measures which actually can make a difference. So rather than saying go solve everything, let's look at things we can fix step by step.
So it's been very well reviewed, the book, and in fact the calibre of the reviews spikes the guns of the question that I'm minded to ask you now, which is about how the readers can trust you to be a fair judge when you are a Labour man through and through, Director of Comms under Ed Miliband, or certainly Director, yes, and a senior political advisor to Ed Miliband. And yet the reviews make it clear that you are probing in your search for the essence of Keir Starmer. Reassure my listeners that this isn't a hagiography.
Well, the origins of this book were actually in an autobiography that Keir was trying to write, and I think he eventually realised he didn't have time as leader of the opposition, and also he didn't really want 300 pages talking about himself.
No.
He felt uncomfortable with that. And so he killed that off, and I was helping him with it. And then we met in a pub, and I said, look, I do think your story is still there to be told, and how about a biography? And he said, well, maybe. And I said, well, if this is going to work, it can't be an approved biography. Yeah. I can't have your office going through it line by line. And I need to talk to your critics. And I think I've done that as fairly as I can. Look, I am what I am. I'm a Labour Party person. When I was a journalist, I was probably a Labour-leading journalist. But I don't think you do justice to him unless you recognise that, like everyone else, he's got flaws. Sometimes his critics have got a point. And, if people are going to vote for him, they need to vote for the person rather than some sort of spun-dried image.
And he's not comfortable putting it out there, is he? It's probably easier for you to do it. And there is a lot out there. I've interviewed him a few times, including once on stage for a significant period of time. And I still struggle with the dichotomy between what you can see in a one-on-one scenario and what doesn't come across in the House of Commons. Presumably everybody's hoping this will help. I mean, there's a real vulnerability in some of the conversations about his father and his father's inability to show love or pride, and the discovery then of a notebook. I loved what he said about he could tell his dad had put it together because his dad as a toolmaker was a craftsman, and it had been assembled not just with splodges of Pritt stick and stuff like that, but it would have looked like a sort of little work of art. Talks about his brother struggling terribly in the education system and being very, very shabbily treated. There is a hell of a lot to him. Why is it that many people, I mean, will be surprised to discover that? Why does he struggle to get that across? Is it the lawyer in him that wouldn't just go there?
Part of it's the lawyer, and there's a interesting analysis from his friend Philippe Sands, who's another lawyer who transitioned to a sort of public figure. He says you have a courtroom voice as a lawyer, and it's quite hard to lose that. It's also the way the law works. You're trying to argue a point of law and a points of fact. You don't win your case on the fact you grew up in a Pebble-Dash semi and your dad was a toolmaker. Yeah. But there's something else too about Starmer, which I think is important, in that background, that difficult relationship with his father, that sort of the questions of class in the 1970s. I think that holds him back. I mean, he's part of his generation. He's a very English man. He doesn't talk about himself. People don't. They don't, if you go to a pub with your mates, you don't say, let me tell you my backstory. You certainly don't say, let me tell you what my vision is for the country. It'd be embarrassing. So there's something almost out of the ordinary about him. He's extraordinary and ordinary.
You mentioned class, and it's probably one of the most misused tropes, isn't it, in political discourse, certainly when it comes to dissecting the personalities of politicians. His roots are absolutely working class, aren't they? The fact that his mother never had a passport, the fact that his dad was a toolmaker, and felt that he had, or Starmer certainly feels that his dad didn't have a fair crack of the whip, I think, which almost sums up the nature of a restrictive class system.
I think the class in him is really interesting because to be a toolmaker, it was actually be at the very top of the working class hierarchy. There's the people who made the tools which people had, they were they were sort of aristocracy of the working class. And normally a toolmaker would get a great deal of respect. If he was growing up in Bolton, people have known what a toolmaker was. If you're in Oxted in Surrey, they don't. They just look down at you because you work in a factory. So it's a complicated relationship. He's also got these three siblings who didn't go to grammar school, didn't go to university. And so, of course, is Keir Starmer working class now? I'd say he comes from a working class background. And his family are still working class. And so he's got that lived experience and living experience through them. But, also his story is one of aspiration. He's very driven. He wants to succeed at everything he does. He's gone to university. He's had a stellar academic and legal career. He now wants to succeed at politics. So part of this story is one of mobility, and part of the story is about the brother and two sisters he left behind.
You don't go in deep on potential friction in the party, do you? In the shadow cabinet on the front bench. Well, is that because there isn't any? It's been exaggerated by right-wing media, but that's not true, is it? Because it's I've read about it in left-wing media as well. Tensions between him and Angela Rayner, for example.
Well, there's a good interview of Angela Rayner who talks about the moment when they fell out, and she's pretty explicit that they did fall out. She also talks about Starmer as the least political person she knows in politics, and how that can be a strength and a weakness. So Starmer, he doesn't know which members of his shadow cabinet were Blairites or Brownites. He wasn't around then. He's not very interested in that. He's not interested in factions. He's not interested in building a whole bunch of Starmerites. That allows him to move faster without the baggage sometimes. But will that become a problem in government when he doesn't have a lot of people who die in the ditch for him who have signed up in blood to be part of the Starmer, guard? I don't know. There are lots of things we don't know yet because he hasn't been in government. The real tests of Starmer will be in government. All you can look at is what he's done so far. So he's got this record at the Crown Prosecution Service where he effectively ran a government department. That's worth looking at more, I think. How he reforms services. He's also run the Labour Party for the last 4 years, and he's brought change there. And when he took over as leader of the Labour Party, a lot of people were saying, you've got no chance, it's 2 terms at least. They wrote him off.
They certainly did.
The same people are now saying he's got no chance in government, it's all going to be a disaster. I do think, having underestimated him once, they might show a little bit more humility before underestimating him again.
That's nicely put. Putting your other hats on, director of comms or political editor, what's he got wrong? What are the biggest missteps he's made since becoming leader?
I think he's made 2 quite recently. He misspoke on this station.
Yes.
He's talking about Israel Gaza, and he didn't correct the record fast enough. I think some of his people thought it would go away, and it didn't. What's interesting about him when he makes a mistake is, rather than doubling down behind it and saying, I've been right all along, he learns. So he's got a lot of foreign policy experience in the Commonwealth, in Europe, with America, through his career before. I don't think he knew a great deal about the Middle East. He does now. He spent a huge amount of time in the last couple of months talking to Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, flying to Qatar, speaking to the King of Jordan, speaking to players in the Middle East. I think that's encouraging, in that if you make a mistake, how do you correct it rather than make that mistake worse?
It's the lawyer's way, isn't it? You approach a case, you have to almost become an expert in the detail of the case with every case that you approach. So the phrase getting across your brief exists because of lawyers, and it's very much part of his credo.
And he's a competitive bloke.
What's the second mistake?
Well, I think he made a mistake, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, over the Rochdale by-election.
Right. Should have got rid of the candidate sooner.
He should have done, and I think he realises that. But again...
Why? Because of what the candidate originally said, or because anybody with their head screwed on would have known that the Mail had held back the really bad stuff for day 2?
Both? Probably both. But, he's away that weekend. And again, it's an understandable mistake in that you don't often see party leaders dump a candidate in the middle of a by-election you're expected to win.
Especially when they're already on the ballot sheet.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you sort of... Sometimes I think people don't always see the wood for the trees. He's sometimes slow to come to the right decision, and sometimes he takes a circuitous route to it. But that's not the same as being indecisive. And so in the end, I think he got to the right place. And when people step back from the Rochdale controversy, what will they really remember? Will they remember that he was a 12-hour delay before he dumped the candidate? Or will they remember that he's the first party leader in living memory to dump a candidate in the middle of a by-election he's expected to win? I think it'll be the latter.
Who needs to read the book, do you think? Who's your ideal reader? Who's the reader that you would really want this book to land in front of?
The entire country.
Well, obviously, from a commercial point of view.
If I get as many readers as you do, James, I'll be a very happy man.
We don't talk about my books on this programme, Tom.
I heard you.
No, never. No. We don't do self-reference. It's so unseemly. But seriously, who? I mean, in terms of swingable pendulums or swayable votes, who are you thinking of?
The person I'm thinking of most, I suppose, is the person who says to me, Keir Starmer's boring. I don't know what he stands for. Does Labour really represent anything? Is Labour just the same as the Tories now? And I think those questions are answered as far as I can in this book. And it takes a book to answer that, because he is complicated.
Yeah.
I don't think I could answer it in a single interview. I don't think he can answer it in a single speech. But there is an answer. And if people are interested in politics and interested in where this country would go under a Keir Starmer government, I think they should read my book.
Has he read it?
He is reading it. He's got one of the advanced copies. And like the private person is, I think he's feeling raw in places about exposing himself as much as he has had to and talking about things. And I think he's sometimes embarrassed about the extent that he's put things out there. I think in the end it does him and the reader a service. If people want to vote against him after reading this book, at least they'll be well informed.
Tom Baldwin, whose book Keir Starmer, The Biography, is due for release next week, although you can both pre-order it now and quite possibly find it in bookshops. But it is a proper tome, and it is one of the books that you should read before voting in the next general election. The challenge, the question, of course, is how you get it into the hands who would benefit most from reading it. So I hope that we've helped a little bit with that mission today. Tom, always a pleasure. The time is 12:48. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:52 is the time. I'm beginning to wonder why I bothered, to be honest with you. So Esther's been in touch from Bournemouth. I'd like to look after Esther. She says, have I missed the answer to the dirtiest river, James? I've been in a Zoom coffee morning with the Lily Foundation. I'd love to know. Look at that. Playing the charity card, Esther, just to pull my guilt levers and make me give you a special bespoke. It was the River Mersey. It's the third most poisoned in the world in the context of what are rather laughably called forever chemicals. And I don't know, I might save the sweets for tomorrow, actually. This is some research into what the country's favourite sweets are. And I'm struck really by the omissions from the list. But before that, I wanted to do something arguably a little bit more serious. You know how desperately, some may say violently, I resist the urge to say I told you so on this programme. I don't resist the urge to engage in I told you so style shenanigans. I just don't like the actual phrase I told you so. I think it sounds a bit infantile. So I am resisting that urge once again here. But I wonder whether you remember an exchange I had with the president of the National Farmers Union in would it be about 2021, I think, if memory serves?
My job is to represent farmers and make sure that their case is heard by government. And, you know, it's not just about George Eustice in all of this. The Prime Minister has made cast iron.
We keep coming back to this, and I am going to, I'm afraid, remind you that he made cast iron guarantees to the people of Northern Ireland and business people in Northern Ireland about the likelihood of there being any border put in the Irish Sea. So where are you deriving your confidence that he'll keep his promises to you?
Well, he is the Prime Minister, and my job is to hold him to account.
He was Prime Minister when he promised there'd be no checks on trade with Northern Ireland from the Great Britain mainland.
He was, but this is where the power of the people is so important. You know, the people have put him into that place. They've got a massive majority government. The people of this country drew a line in the sand last year when over 1 million people in 2 weeks signed up to this and said they wanted trade to be fair. They wanted food imports to be produced to the same standards. I don't believe they will ever, ever forgive him if he reneges on that commitment. And we see a mass departure of farmers in our countryside. So he has to keep to his word. I hope this one will stick to his commitment. But I share your concerns of the past.
And in conclusion, then, you are, in many ways, the future of British farming depends upon Boris Johnson's ability to keep his word.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And
Otto. See that Otto there? I think we cut that off a little prematurely, actually. We should have we should have revelled in the Otto. I should have done a bit more, been a bit more theatrical, but these are serious matters, and you know me. I'm a very serious man. So Rishi Sunak became the first Prime Minister since Gordon Brown, would you believe, to turn up at the National Farmers Union yesterday. And Minette Batters, during her speech, almost... Well, I suppose you could describe this as asking or finding out, how did that decision to put all your trust in Boris Johnson turn out? And I'm a fan of Minette Batters, don't get me wrong, contempt for the conmen, compassion for the conned. But I think it's time to catch up on how did that decision to put all your trust, and indeed the future of British farming, in the hands of Boris Johnson's hoped-for integrity, how did that turn out for you?
I became president in 2018, and we immediately went to the cliff edge, not once, but 3 times, with the prospect of a catastrophic no-deal Brexit. My second term started in 2020. Within a month, COVID-19 had struck, we were in lockdown and leading the NFU from our farms. Our staff were all working from home, and a combination of Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Trump were committed to concluding a US-UK free trade agreement by August. And let's not forget the Johnson government was legislating on raising standards of animal welfare and environmental protection here at home. But that same government was only too happy to import food that would be illegal to produce here. And it was a morally bankrupt position.
So there it is. What a difference 3 years makes, almost to the day, from the president of the National Farmers Union, explaining that she felt she had little choice but to entrust the future of British farming to stake it all on the hope that Boris Johnson would turn out to be an honest man, and then 3 years later describing his entire premiership as morally bankrupt. And it is, of course, the farmers that pay the price. But hey, some good news for farmers, because you'll never guess who's got your back. Seriously.
It is an incredible thing you do. Right? You don't do it for the money, for sure. Right? You do it because you love it. You do it because you feel a responsibility. You do it because it's tradition. And I'm enormously grateful to you for it.
Has he ever met a farmer? Just listen to that again. Seriously.
It is an incredible thing you do. Right? You don't do it for the money, for sure.
They don't do
right?
it
You
for
do
the
it because
money.
you love it. You do it because you feel a responsibility. You do it because it's tradition. And I'm enormously grateful to you for it.
I appreciate that you don't typify the entire farming community as being sort of violently avaricious or massively greedy, but of course they do it for the money. So I do this for the money. Sheila Fogarty, you do this for the money.
I do it for free.
Well, you do, yes, I know, but that's since you won the lottery. But what is he what is he actually talking about? He says you don't do it for money. We nearly did this as a topic, but farmers, I tell you what it is. I live in constant fear of Alan Partridge. I mean, anyway, I live in constant fear of turning into Alan Partridge. But on the question of farmers, you remember that exchange when Alan Partridge said, if you see a lovely field with a family having a picnic and there's a nice pond in it, you lot fill up the pond with concrete, you plough the family into the field, you blow up the tree and you use the leaves to make a dress for your wife who's also your brother. It's very easy to alienate the farmers. And I'm very conscious of not wanting to do that. So we didn't do a phone-in today on the question of what the hell Rishi Sunak was doing. But if you are a farmer and you're listening to this, on your tractor perhaps, did you know that you weren't doing it for money? Perhaps you could give me a ring tomorrow and tell me what you were doing it for, because that is it for today's programme. You can listen back in entirety to this programme. But if you are listening on catch-up, stop sending me texts. It just confuses me. You're sending me texts that are 54 minutes out of date. And I don't want your excuses either about getting out of the car, telling me to be nice, because you get out of the car, Global Player stops, you get back in the car, it starts again where you left off. That's fine. But don't send me texts that I get confused by because you're asking... Well, anyway... It's all there. You can pause and rewind live radio. You can download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Freebie Fogarty.
Isn't it a compliment that they text you out
Yes, of course it is.
of time?
I'm being disingenuous.
Stop being so grumpy.
I am being grumpy.
God
I
in heaven.
apologise.
God in
I'm only here for the money.
That's true. Thank you, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.